The hidden fortune.
The cave buzzed with excitement. The mercenaries chatted and laughed as they sifted through the remnants of the bandits' horde. Maxime turned to Tenna, curiosity gleaming in his eyes. "What did you just say, Tenna? How much did that damned bandit leader stash away?" Tenna, the saber-toothed tiger treasurer, grinned as she held up a handful of gleaming coins. "Over 30,000 silver coins and 100 gold coins, chief," she declared, her voice laced with excitement. As she and a few other mercenaries sorted through the towering pile of loot, they had stumbled upon a wooden chest packed with wealth. The moment Tenna had cracked it open, she had let out an astonished cry. With the help of a dozen mercenaries, they had quickly counted the coins, leading to this staggering total. Maxime's thoughts drifted as he stared at the glittering hoard. Thievery really does pay well. For a brief moment, he even entertained the idea of abandoning mercenary work in favor of something more lucrative. But then he recalled the suffering these bandits had inflicted on the people of eternity, the plundering, the destruction, the misery they had left in their wake. His expression darkened with a flicker of anger before he pushed the thought aside. No, there's a better way. An idea took root in his mind.
Setting up checkpoints.
That could work. If the mercenary group secured trade routes between towns, merchants would be willing to pay a small fee in exchange for protection. They could eliminate bandits in the region and, if some proved useful, recruit them, so long as they hadn't crossed any moral lines. Merchants would save money on hiring escorts, and his group would profit without pillaging innocents. But as quickly as the plan formed, Maxime shook his head.
No. We're still too weak.
We'd need the power of a viscount at least. Otherwise, we'd just be crushed by the combined forces of lesser nobles. A possible long-term solution surfaced in his mind, but it wasn't something he could act on yet. Power over wealth. Maxime turned back to Tenna. "I'm going to secure most of this fortune in a safe place," he announced. "The rest will be used to keep the mercenary group running." Tenna nodded, relaying his orders to the others. As the mercenaries filed out of the cave, Maxime stood alone before the open chest, eyes fixed on the fortune inside. "Damn. This is over 400 gold coins in total," he murmured, still in disbelief. To put that into perspective, Knight Ron had only offered 200 gold coins to fight Baron Barton. Even Baron Barton himself had only put up 200 gold to exterminate the bandits, 300 gold once the job was complete. Maxime wasn't naive enough to think he'd get that full sum easily. Gold in hand is the only gold that matters. His mind quickly shifted to how best to use this wealth. With the university exam coming up, my priority is personal strength. Having mercenaries under my command gives me points, but physical strength matters more. System: display my balance. Available balance: 175 gold coins. His thoughts raced. I can either strengthen my swordsman class or unlock a new one. But from what he had learned, maxing out an existing class before acquiring a new one was the best way to increase the chances of getting a rare or uncommon class. Some classes, like swordsman, were common. Others, like horseman, were uncommon. Rarer still were classes like berserker. Then there were legendary classes, dragon tamer for example, which were beyond rare and required strict conditions to obtain. If Maxime wanted to maximize his strength and his future potential, there was only one choice. He would invest everything into strengthening his swordsman class. Breaking limits. A glowing interface appeared before him. Swordsman, 0 out of 100 plus. Maxime pressed the plus sign firmly. Swordsman, 1 out of 100 plus. Swordsman, 9 out of 100 plus. Swordsman, 24 out of 100 plus. Swordsman, 37 out of 100 plus. Swordsman, 55 out of 100 plus. Swordsman, 63 out of 100 plus. As he advanced, a wave of heat surged through his body, strengthening him from within. The sensation was intoxicating, so much so that he nearly let out a groan. Swordsman, 87 out of 100 plus. Swordsman, 95 out of 100 plus. Swordsman, 100 out of 100.
Ding.
Swordsman class increased to level 4.
Ding.
Passive traits enhanced. Physical bonus with swords, 5%, 7%. Training efficiency bonus, 10%, 15%.
Ding.
Physique improved by 0.2 points. Maxime clenched his fists, feeling his new power. I should be able to fight Romuald on even ground now. But his expression soon turned serious. Knights require at least 3 physique points, and that's just the bare minimum. Once they awaken their vital seed, they can push to 3.5, and with special techniques, even 3.8. Elite knights, grand knights and epic knights, had physique scores of 4 or higher. A typical viscount's family had at least one grand knight, while a marquis family boasted multiple grand knights and senior knights. But the duke's family and the royal family? Their strength was an utter mystery. Rumors say the royal family has an epic knight among them. Maxime knew mercenaries who reached Grand Knight level were rare, but they existed. To reach Grand Knight, a person needed 6-star potential, a rarity in any kingdom. Even the kingdom of the Frost Eagle had only a handful of mercenary captains at that level.
That was still far beyond him for now. A risk worth taking.
With newfound determination, Maxime began collecting silver and gold coins from the chest. Balance, 75 gold coins. Balance, 90 gold coins, 2,100 silver coins. Balance, 110 gold coins, 4,900 silver coins. Balance, 150 gold coins, 15,000 silver coins.
Ding.
Automatic conversion of silver to gold.
Ding.
Current balance, 300 gold coins. Maxime's gaze hardened. Without hesitation, he poured more of his wealth into his swordsman class. Swordsman, 0/125 plus. Swordsman, 23/125 plus. Swordsman, 48/125 plus. Swordsman, 125/125.
Ding.
Swordsman class increased to level 5.
Ding.
Passive traits enhanced. Physical bonus with swords, 7%, 9%. Training efficiency bonus, 15%, 20%.
Ding.
Physique improved by 0.3 points. Despite his growing strength, Maxime sighed. The cost keeps rising. At first, 10 to 20 gold coins gave him 0.2 physique points.
Now?
He was spending 10 times that for the same boost.
But he knew, this was the path of power.
Physique, 1.95, 2.45. A final notification flashed before his eyes.
Ding.
You've unlocked a new talent.
Maxime's heart pounded.
What have I just unlocked? As for you, your wages for the next 12 months will go directly to the children. A collective sigh escaped from the bandits as Maxime spoke. If this was meant to be a punishment, it hardly felt like one. At least they weren't subjected to physical torment, and they would still have shelter, food, and the ability to train without worry. Given their circumstances, this was more than acceptable. Maxime didn't spare them another glance as he moved past them, Laura and Organ leading the way. The mercenaries followed closely, all except the former rebels, their gazes lingering on Iris with newfound respect. After all, Iris had proven himself. His sheer willpower and courage ensured he would become a key figure within their ranks. Minutes later, they arrived at the back of the cave, where the bandit leader had stashed his so-called treasures. Well, this looks like a dragon's hoard. Maxime muttered as his eyes swept over the pile before him. Scattered across the floor was a mountain of various objects: armor, weapons, trinkets, and supplies. Even goblins would have organized their loot better, Andrew scoffed, his expression darkening. Maxime nodded, already regretting that he hadn't planned to transport all of it. The sheer volume was overwhelming, and even if he did manage to haul it back to town, he had nowhere to store it. At that moment, Romuald stepped forward, a calculated look in his eyes. "Chief, may I ask, what is your ultimate goal in forming this mercenary group?" Maxime raised an eyebrow at the unexpected question, but answered without hesitation.
"Didn't I already say? To grow stronger.
To protect my family."
Romuald shook his head. "Chief, that's too naive."
A few mercenaries frowned at his blunt words, but no one interrupted. Romuald's rank and strength commanded respect. After all, even Maxime and Andrew weren't certain they could defeat him one-on-one. With a physique rating of 2.3, he was among the strongest in their ranks. The stronger we become, the more we'll attract the attention of powerful forces. If we're not careful, we'll be caught up in struggles far beyond our reach. Maxime remained silent, considering Romuald's words. "You have something in mind, don't you?" he finally asked.
"Indeed, Chief.
As a former guard captain, I know how noble families operate. The best advice I can offer is this: always keep a portion of our strength hidden. Let no one know our full power. It will give us an edge when the time comes." Maxime's eyes lit up in realization. This was the kind of knowledge he would have never learned in school, the kind of wisdom that came only through experience. "Then we'll leave the treasure here," Maxime declared, his voice filled with conviction. "This will be our first stronghold. We'll start by constructing simple huts in the forest and setting up surveillance lines to prevent ambushes." The children we've taken in will be trained here, overseen by the former bandits and a few of our mercenaries. We'll also rotate our forces, some staying in town while others remain stationed here. The town-based mercenaries will bring in supplies while slowly liquidating any useless items from the treasure hoard. As Maxime continued assigning roles and structuring their new operations, his men listened in stunned silence. It had taken only a few words from Romuald for Maxime to construct a near-perfect strategy to elevate their mercenary group to new heights. As everyone got to work, Maxime exhaled, feeling the mental strain ease. The past few hours had pushed his mind to its limits, but seeing everything fall into place brought him a sense of satisfaction. Meanwhile, not far from the cave, a group of men combed through the forest, meticulously searching for signs of the bandits' hideout. Unbeknownst to them, most of the bandits were either dead or had already sworn allegiance to Maxime. A towering figure strode towards the search party, his presence alone commanding attention.
So? What have you found? The man asked.
Lord Ron. The scouts saluted in unison. The knight's imposing figure stood out even among his men. This was none other than Chevalier Ron, the same knight Maxime and his mercenaries had encountered after the bandits' ambush. There's plenty of evidence that people have been passing through here, one of the scouts reported. Ron's sharp eyes scanned the area.
Good.
Find their hideout before nightfall, and you'll each be rewarded with a gold coin. The prospect of such a reward sent a ripple of excitement through the group as they redoubled their efforts. Ron smirked to himself, pleased with their eagerness, until a faint scent caught his attention.
Wait, do you smell that? He asked.
His men hesitated, sniffing the air, but detected nothing. Ron's eyes narrowed.
Blood.
The smell of human blood. A slow grin spread across his face. The knights possessed far sharper senses than ordinary men.
He knew what this meant.
Why are you still standing there?
Ron snapped.
Alert the others. We've found their trail. As his scouts hurried away, Ron turned his gaze towards the cave's direction. Though it lay 300 meters away, hidden among trees and brush, he was certain of it. He had finally located the bandits he had been hunting for so long.
Back in the cave.
Laughter and chatter filled the cavern as the mercenaries busied themselves. Maxime stood at the center, reviewing their next steps, when Tenna approached with an incredulous look. Chief, you won't believe how much silver that bastard of a bandit leader had hidden here. Maxime turned to her, curiosity piqued.
Oh?
Just how much are we talking? Unaware of the danger marching toward them, the mercenaries remained immersed in their plans, completely oblivious to the storm about to descend upon them.
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
You've unlocked a new talent.
A new talent? Night talent, weak.
I've unlocked the night talent? Maxime was pleasantly surprised. Indeed, he didn't know that reaching level 6 of the Swordsman class could confer this talent. This could be explained by the fact that rich and powerful families blocked a lot of information, but also because nobody had exactly the same classes. So now one of my goals is to find a night-breathing method. As long as I have one, I'll have a method other than money to increase my stats. And above all, my fighting power will increase significantly. Maxime clenched his fist, happy with the changes. As long as I don't meet any knights, I'm invincible. System displays my stats while indicating the differences from the start of the day.
Identity, Maxime Voldruv. Class. Peasant level 3. Level max. Plus 3% to physique.
Swordsman level 3, 6, plus 5% physics, 0 of 175. Unlocked a new class, 0 of 50. Physique, 2.75, plus 0.22 class bonus, plus 0.30 passive trait bonus.
Chi, 0. Skills.
Swordsmanship level 2, 70 out of 100. Frank language proficiency level 2, 35 out of 100.
Passive trait.
Plus 5%, plus 11% physicality when wielding a sword. Plus 10%, 25% training efficiency with a sword.
Talent.
Nox limit level 1, rank unknown, 0/1000.
Minor stamina talent. Minor strength talent. Night talent, weak.
Money available, 25 gold coins. Mercenary. Andrew, 3-star potential.
Physical, 2-3.
Terry, 2-star potential. Physical, 1.7.
James, 2-star potential. Physical, 1.8.
Piedro, 2-star potential. Physics, 1.8.
Izo, 2-star potential.
Physics,
1.9. Peter, 2-star potential. Physical, 1.6. Alessandro, 2-star potential. Physics, 1.5. Ronnie, 2-star potential. Physical, 1.6. Romuald, 2-star potential and a minor talent in physics. Physical, 2.3. Joe, 2-star potential. Physical, 1.5. Tenna, 2-star potential and a minor intelligence talent. Physical, 2. Rodrigo, 2-star potential and an elemental affinity with the earth. Physical, 1.9. Ernest, 3-star potential. Physical, 2.2. After a month's training, the statistics of all the mercenaries had indeed changed. The only mercenary with no change was Romuald. Probably because of his talent, since usually a mercenary with 2-star potential reached a maximum of 2 physics points. Romuald was able to reach 2.3 points thanks to his minor talent in physics, but this was indeed the limit of his talent. Maxime sighed slightly at this realization. Even his Nox limit talent couldn't do more at the moment. Perhaps when he took his talent to the next level, things would change. At the same time, Maxime noted the statistics of a few new members. Romaine's daughter, potential unknown, talent unknown. Physical, 0.4. Child, potential unknown, talent unknown. Physical, 0.3. Child, potential unknown, talent unknown. Physical, 0.5. Child, potential unknown, talent unknown. Physical, 0.4. It seems normal that the system isn't omniscient and doesn't know the first name of each individual in the group, but the practical side being that it records an image of each individual so that at least there's something to know who's who. Commented Maxime in a whisper. Maxime knew that it was normal for the system not to be able to display the potential and talent of these children. A person's potential and talent couldn't be known before the age of 16 according to normal methods. Iris, potential 2 stars. Physical, 1.3. Organ, potential 3 stars. Physical, 2.1. Laura, 3-star potential. Physical, 2.3. As expected, Iris isn't very strong, but with his courage he may be able to accomplish great things. On the side of the former bandit leaders, they have somehow managed to overcome the limits of their potentials before, and managed to achieve these impressive scores. 2.1 physique points for Organ is impressive given her age, but the most shocking thing is still Laura. 2.3 physique points, how on earth did she achieve that physique without any particular talent? As Maxime pondered intensely the various changes that had occurred recently, a loud voice came from the distance, disrupting his moment of introspection. Chief. Maxime turned and saw Peter running towards him. No good. Knight Ron and his men have entered the cave. Our men are also facing them with Andrew as leader, but at any moment a confrontation could take place. Looking at Peter's sweaty face and his ominous words, Maxime took on a solemn look. At the entrance to the cave. I see some familiar faces around here, Ron declared humorously. In front of him were still many corpses that had not yet been buried. Andrew stood at the front of the dozens of saber-toothed tiger mercenaries. His face seemed somewhat cold as he gripped the handle of his sword tightly. His sword still hanging from the sheath on his belt. Chevalier Ron, as you can see we've been dealing with the bandits who were ransacking the villages in the area. So you can leave with a clear conscience, Andrew declared in a tone devoid of emotion. Ron put on a disgruntled face, then ordered directly. Search this cave from top to bottom, find the bandit leader's head and his treasures. The men accompanying him immediately set to work, advancing fearlessly towards the mercenaries blocking their path. You dare! Shouted Andrew, drawing his sword and pointing it at the advancing soldiers. All the mercenaries also drew their weapons, ready to fight at any moment. In addition, the rest of the mercenaries and the recently recruited bandits continued to arrive. The original dozens of mercenaries soon grew to around 50, and the numbers kept rising. The situation worsened as more people kept arriving. As their side grew stronger, the mercenaries' momentum gradually increased, although it was still intimidating to face 100 trained soldiers with a knight at their head. Ron stepped forward, his face grim. A common third-rate mercenary dares to threaten a knight? If you don't move out of the way, I'll see to it that you do, whether you like it or not. But Andrew didn't move an inch, and stood his ground with a firm face. However, many of the mercenaries panicked. Most came from Nansoy and had long heard of the martial prowess a knight could wield. It was even said that it was better to face a 3-meter-high orc than a knight. Of course, Andrew and the Quessois mercenaries had also heard about it from the old village chief. But fear is one thing, defying it another.
Dare to attack and we'll show you that we third-rate mercenaries, like you said, aren't vegetarians, Andrew declared, challenging Ron. The straight-backs of Pietro, Izo and Romuald, who were standing at Andrew's side, reassured the rest of the mercenaries behind. Some even found the courage to step forward and stand beside them. How childish and naive, Ron commented with a cold face. Since he had awakened his vital seed and become a knight, he had rarely been challenged in such a way, let alone by vulgar mercenaries of no renown. Even if he was challenged, it was at least by another baron's knights. Since that's what you wish. The next moment Ron's silhouette disappeared from its previous location, then reappeared right in front of Andrew. Andrew's eyes widened in amazement as he was able to follow Ron's silhouette with his own eyes, but he had absolutely no time to react to protect himself. Ron still had some restraint and simply used his fist. This was simply to avoid losses on his side, but also to give himself one more chance to subdue the mercenary group. Once this is over, I'll make sure I bring this mercenary group back and use it well against Baron Barton. If Baron Iret has a few more chess pieces, it will increase his chances of success. As various thoughts ran through Knight Ron's mind, a blurred silhouette passed over the mercenaries. Then, before the shocked eyes of Andrew, the mercenaries and the soldiers, an individual crossed his fist with that of Chevalier Ron. The individual took 5 steps back from the impact, while Knight Ron took 3. But it was enough to shock everyone. Chevalier Ron, dare to attack my men, you don't lack courage. Ron still looked lost as he saw the young blonde-haired figure standing before him. You, how is this possible? Asked Ron shocked. But he quickly calmed down. Years of training and time spent on the battlefield had given him extraordinary composure. Even if I didn't use all my strength, an elite soldier would have been seriously injured if he'd taken my blow. Thought Ron quickly. But this guy was even able to fend me off. If he doesn't have the strength of a knight, he shouldn't be far from the minimum threshold. Ron's analytical skills deserve praise. With his experience he could estimate an opponent's strength after a simple exchange. But it made him even more confused. After all, this kind of character shouldn't exist in their region. Can you remind me of your identity, young man? Asked Ron with a face quite different from when he was addressing Andrew. Maxime, captain of the saber-toothed tigers, Maxime replied simply. Obviously he wasn't going to reveal his family name in this world where having a family name was synonymous with nobility. Andrew and the mercenaries who knew Maxime's strength well were now totally confused. A few weeks earlier, they'd had similar strength, so how could their captain's strength have changed so suddenly? Ron took a quick breath to put his thoughts in order. It is now impossible to subdue this group by force without suffering casualties. The losses would outweigh the gains. In any case, they are mercenaries, so as long as the price is sufficient we can recruit them easily without suffering losses. We'll quickly regain our investment once Baron Barton is defeated and his domain reclaimed. As his own soldiers, but also the blonde-haired young man and his mercenaries watched him, Ron made his decision. Everyone out of here, please, Ron announced. His men acted directly, while the saber-toothed tigers looked at Maxime, who nodded in their direction, asking them to obey. Sensing Ron's intentions, Maxime asked for 2 chairs and a table. A few minutes later, Ron and Maxime stood face to face around a small, dilapidated wooden table. Ron's chair was particularly creaky under the weight of his body and armor. I apologize for the 200 gold coins I offered you a few days ago, but I underestimated the strength of your group, Ron began. After a few seconds' hesitation, he added. Especially yours. Maxime wasn't particularly offended, and simply smiled in response. I'd like to recruit your mercenary group to attack Baron Barton, Ron declared, getting straight to the point. Maxime straightened up and looked Ron directly in the eye. So now, how much is our mercenary group worth to you? He asked with force in his eyes. Despite the youth of the man in front of him, Ron didn't dare spoil things. First he asked. How strong is the saber-toothed tiger group right now? Maxime thought for a few seconds, adapting his vocabulary to this world. In total my count is 63 mercenaries including myself. I'm not counting here the personnel dealing with logistics. Concerning the exact strength, we have 20 mercenaries reaching the level of elite soldier. An elite soldier could be designated as such once he reached a physique of 1.5. Of course, Maxime remained conservative and didn't expose his full strength directly. Ron knew this too, but as long as the estimate was correct, it didn't matter. In any case, reality wouldn't change too much since this would be detrimental to Maxime in negotiations. He also knew he had a closed card with his talent in case things went wrong. Otherwise, the news that a group of non-renowned mercenaries was almost half full of men at the level of elite soldiers might shock Ron. And that counted the bandits' recent integration, otherwise everyone would have been at elite soldier level at the very least. I have 6 mercenaries reaching the level of an apprentice knight. Here, Maxime decided to tell the truth, since it was this number that was most important for the negotiations. To be considered an apprentice knight, you had to have at least 2 physical points. For example, Georgie, who commanded some of the bandits, was at this level. Among the apprentice knights were Andrew, Romuald, Tenna, Ernest, Laura, and Organ. On hearing this, Ron's eyes widened in surprise, and he rose almost immediately from his chair. He had to know that even among all his soldiers there were only 2 who had the level of an apprentice knight. And Ron knew that among all the Baron's troops, there were less than 15 apprentice knights. Indeed, the talent to become a knight was rare. But the most shocking part hadn't been said yet. Concerning my strength, I'm at the peak stage of the apprentice knight, Maxime declared. The difference between an apprentice knight with 2 physique points and 3 physique points is considerable. So, depending on physique, the apprentice knight can be divided into several stages. Entry 2-2-3. Small success 2-3-2-6. Grand success 2-6-2-9.
Peak 2 nines.
It was possible to become a knight with 3 or more physics points, but it was complicated to become a knight with only 3 physics points. Generally speaking, apprentice knights awakened their vital seed at around 3.2 or even 3.3 physical points. It seemed preferable to do it this way, as after reaching the knight stage, the breathing method generally lost much of its effect on strengthening the body. So to have a chance of one day reaching the Grand Knight stage, many knights strengthened their bodies by riding the battlefields to stimulate their vital seed. His actual stats are at the level of an apprentice knight at the stage of great success with a physique of 2.75 points, but thanks to class bonuses he reaches an impressive score of 2.97 points. It was thanks to this physique that he was able to fend off Ron, even though the latter hadn't used all his strength. And if he's holding a sword, he can have a physique reaching a surprising 3.27 physique points. But if we're talking in mercenary language, I'm a 4-star mercenary at the peak. Although Ron had already guessed it, he was still surprised by Maxime's words. And it was in the case of Maxime remaining modest, if he took into account the active effect of his talent, he could crush the majority of knights. But this remained Maxime's closed card, he would never promote it and would make sure it remained a secret. Damn, this guy's not far off the level of the capital's monstrous geniuses. Thought Ron, reacting to Maxime's words. Could he be the illegitimate son of a marquis or a duke? Coming to his senses, Ron made a few mental calculations, then said, 800 gold coins and free housing for your troops for 2 years in Hippocamp. Hippocamp being Baron Irit's main town and also his hometown. In Ron's mind, the free accommodation would mainly enable the mercenary group to stay on his territory and thus become a force affiliated to Baron Irit after a certain period of time. Maxime smiled, then said, okay for the 800 gold coins and the free housing, but I'd also like Baron Berthan's breathing method. Impossible! Exclaimed Chevalier Ron directly. Why not? Asked Maxime calmly. The breathing method is a method reserved for the nobility only. If anyone discovers that a commoner is secretly practicing it, everyone involved in the affair will be prosecuted by the royal knights. Obviously Maxime knew this. Even any educated person in this world knew it, since the breathing method represented the royal family's control of the kingdom. No one was allowed to practice the breathing method unless they had sworn allegiance to a noble family. Well, then I wouldn't be too greedy and I'd only ask for 1,500 gold coins and free housing for all the saber-toothed tigers for 2 years, Maxime declared gently but at the same time with a certain firmness. This strategy made it harder for Ron to negotiate, but at the same time, he wasn't surprised by Maxime's staggering demands. What could be more disconcerting and surprising than the demand for a breathing method? Baron Irit's net profit was around 500 gold coins a year. After all, the territory's revenues were substantial, but so were its expenses. It was good enough to be able to put aside 500 gold coins in a year. So Maxime's request represented 3 years' savings from Baron Irit's territory. The help of their mercenary group could really prevent us from any unforeseen accidents and deal with various situations we wouldn't have anticipated in our plans. However, with so much money we could also invest it in weapons, armor, or even to borrow a knight from a viscount. But revealing our plan to noble forces could bring about some very important variables in our plan. A nobleman's greed is endless. Investing in a mercenary group provides both short-term strength without increasing the risks of the plan. While Ron pondered, Maxime waited patiently. After a few minutes' consideration, Ron made his decision. 800 gold coins and we'll have a dwelling built for you large enough to accommodate and feed 200 people with a plot of land large enough to train as many people. It was Maxime's turn to be surprised. It was extremely rare for a nobleman to offer land to a commoner. It might even be considered a sin to do so in this world. Maxime pretended to think for a long moment, to give the impression that Chevalier Ron's offer wasn't too high. But on the inside, he was extremely excited. These 800 gold coins were his ticket to the greatest universities in the country. I agree to the offer, but ask for a down payment of 200 gold coins, Maxime finally replied, after completely suppressing his excitement. Ron didn't think long and accepted. Now let's talk well, let's talk little. Tell me all about your plan. Now let's talk well, let's talk little. Tell me all about your plan, Maxime asked with serious eyes. This was no joke, he was betting his future and the lives of all his mercenaries on this mission. Ron sighed slightly, then began to explain everything to Maxime. After a good hour's listening, Maxime had a better understanding of what had gone into triggering this plan, but he also got a good impression of Baron Iret. It turned out that bandits had been operating throughout the region for several years. They regularly targeted villages with relatively few defenses, charging protection fees. If these protection fees weren't paid, a variety of village-related accidents quickly followed. These ranged from a few hunters never returning from the mountains to convoys of goods sent by the village disappearing as if they'd never existed. The various barons in charge of these villages repeatedly tried to set traps for the bandits, but to no avail. On the contrary, various mysterious incidents occurred in the barons' towns. These incidents could simply be sudden bursts of fire in the middle of the night, or gossip about the barons circulating in town. On 2 occasions, however, the barons' hidden mistresses were murdered. Since then, most barons have become frightened, and these protection costs have become normal over time. But in the last few days, the bandits had gone completely mad, going so far as to plunder villages completely, leaving nothing but ashes and despair behind them. Maxime knew that this had been intensified by the arrival of the bandit leader. But Baron Iret had been investigating for several years, and various clues pointed to Baron Barton as the mastermind. The trouble was, the affair had been going on for so long that Baron Barton was no longer the only one involved. There were also other barons who seemed to have joined Baron Barton in tacitly accepting the protection fee. This allowed them to add a new source of income without risking any discontent from the villagers. In any case, they couldn't catch the bandits, so they didn't care. But Baron Iret exploded with anger at the news. For him, it was totally unacceptable to exploit the villagers, whose lives were already so complicated, with these new taxes. Talking about this part, Maxime noticed that Ron's eyes shone with respect and admiration. Later, after he had calmed down, Baron Iret called together several of his relatives and knights and explained the problem. After some discussion, they discovered that the problem was also an opportunity. A legitimate opportunity to declare war on Baron Barton, punish him in the name of the kingdom and gain the title of Viscount by reclaiming his lands. From then on, they prepared their plan to eradicate Baron Barton's family and seize his lands. According to information, only 1 knight served him, but Baron Barton was also a knight, and among knights he was very strong. There were also more than 20 apprentice knights. On Baron Iret's side, in addition to Ron, there was another knight named Tursan. Baron Iret was also a knight, but he didn't practice regularly because of his deep involvement in his territory. So, on the face of it, the balance of power was slightly in Baron Iret's favor. But Baron Barton could enlist the support of other barons at any time. Baron Iret, on the other hand, rarely took part in noble gatherings, and due to his unique outlook on commoners, was one of the marginalized nobles. And marginalized was a strong word. Indeed, he often came into conflict with other nobles because of his ideals. As a result, he was still in open conflict with Baron Kenepes, whose territory adjoined that of Baron Iret. There was also Baron Turquoise, who threatened to intervene on Baron Kenepes's behalf if Baron Iret didn't apologize officially for certain things that had happened. When Chevalier Ron told him all this, Maxime almost began to regret his choice. This wasn't the real world. If one of his mercenaries died here, he'd really die. And no doubt, there would be many deaths in the near future. But the path of a mercenary was like that, there were no great rewards without risk. And this path was always paved with the blood of enemies and friends alike. As Maxime had no other opportunities at the moment, he could only seize them and see what happened. As for a plan of attack, well, they didn't have one. Yet. When Ron told him the news, Maxime sighed in exasperation. "Let me finish managing things here, then I'll go straight to your lord," said Maxime, glancing around at the corpses still lying around them. The big man Ron looked slightly embarrassed as he put his hand on the back of his neck. "Very well, Maxime, we'll see you soon," he said simply, then stood up and left the cave. Maxime heard the sound of Ron's men stirring outside, then gradually the noise evaporated into the distance. As the room fell silent, a few mercenaries approached Maxime. "What are we going to do, Chief?" asked Andrew in a low voice behind Maxime. "You've heard it all, haven't you?" asked Maxime in reply, without turning around. "Only in part, but we've understood the situation overall," replied Andrew with a slight hint of anxiety. "Well, we'll stick to the original plan, building a secondary base here in case things go wrong while most of our troops reside in Baron Irit's town," declared Maxime simply, without too much concern. "You know, I like the idea of serving this Baron Irit, don't you?" asked Maxime, but this time turning around with a cheerful smile. Andrew, Romuald, Tenna, Rodrigo, Ernest and a few other mercenaries looked at each other, clearly worried at finding themselves in such a chaotic situation. Maxime simply smiled in response, then added, "You want to become renowned mercenaries, don't you? Do you know any glorious mercenaries who haven't experienced shitty situations?" Seeing the lack of confidence in his ever-present mercenaries, Maxime continued to smile, then said, "Say it straight if you don't want to go to war, but if you do, you're not fit to be mercenaries." Andrew quickly changed his expression at these words, then replied, "You're right, Chief." He clapped his hands, then ordered the mercenaries to get rid of the corpses first. Various mercenaries arrived at the entrance to the cave and set off. Several mercenaries took charge of lifting the corpses, while others found digging tools and went outside the cave to create the graves. Meanwhile, Maxime remained seated, seemingly watching his men at work, but his thoughts wandered as to the best decisions to take in the future. Night fell quickly. A feast was organized in front of the cave with all the mercenaries and the women and children freed from the bandits. Several mercenaries found musical instruments in the cave and began to play together during the feast. The children and bandits remained reserved at first, but under the mercenaries' jovial mood, everyone temporarily forgot the complicated events of the day, then danced and laughed together. Even some of the women regained a little sparkle in their eyes. Maxime watched all this with rapt attention, enjoying himself and chatting with the mercenaries. Noticing these few details, he smiled happily. In spite of his appearance and his firm, clear-cut words, he hid a compassionate, human heart. The music, rather haphazard but always pleasant, continued for part of the night around the few campfires. Simultaneously, in Baron Barthen's study, candlelight faintly illuminated the room. A strong figure stood on an armchair covered in animal skins. This person was conscientiously writing with pen and ink, on a sheet of brown paper. Only the sound of the quill and melting candles could be heard. Some time passed, and then the sound of footsteps could be heard outside the office door. The impressive figure carefully finished a sentence before gently resting his quill in the inkpot. "You may enter." His powerful voice broke the calm atmosphere that had prevailed until now. A man in armor slowly entered, then without looking at the person in front of him, he knelt down directly. "I've come to make an important report." The eyes of the man in the chair crinkled, showing his concentration.
"Tell me."
The kneeling man still didn't dare look up. "None of the pawns we had with the bandits returned tonight." After this sentence, the room fell silent. After what seemed an interminable time, the powerful voice rang out one last time. "Very well, you may take your leave." After the man in armor had left, the figure in the armchair thought for a few seconds, then picked up his quill again and continued writing. Nothing seemed to have changed, but no one could have guessed that it was from this moment on that powerful currents were about to sweep through the kingdom. The gentle rocking of the hammock and the sound of birdsong greeted him in the subdued light of the forest. His head was still reeling from the previous day's excesses. Without looking down, Maxime quickly guessed that he was several meters up, the hammock tied between two trees. How could this happen? Sighed Maxime, feeling groggy. He opened his eyes, blinking several times to adjust his vision. The majestic trees towered around him, their leaves dancing gently in the wind. A cool breeze caressed his face, bringing with it the earthy scent of the forest. Then he felt a light weight on his chest. Intrigued, he looked down to discover silky black hair splayed across his chest. A woman, sleeping peacefully, her breathing even and calm. Her long hair cascaded down her torso, creating a striking contrast with the surrounding greenery. He stood still, observing the delicate features of her face. A feeling of confusion mixed with curiosity invaded him.
Who was she, anyway?
How had she ended up there with him, in that hammock suspended between two trees? Every detail of the scene seemed unreal, like something out of a dream. But the warmth of her body against his and the soft perfume of her hair confirmed that it was all real. Maxime remained motionless, enjoying the wonderful sensation of waking up with a woman in his arms. Only a few items of clothing concealed their private parts. Time passed quickly, during which Maxime enjoyed the gentle swaying of the hammock in the wind. Life in the forest came to life as the birds sang, signifying the start of a new day. But for the moment, Maxime wanted nothing more to do with it.
Drop in on Baron Irat? Go to war to get stronger?
It was all bullshit. He simply wanted to stay here. At the same time, he tried to remember the evening before. A few flashbacks came to mind as he asked Organ and Laura a few questions during the evening. At that moment, he was doing his job as chief and wanted to know more about his new men and what responsibilities he was going to be able to entrust to them. He also wanted to know their aspirations. He soon learned that Organ was very excited at the prospect of joining the mercenary group, since this opportunity would mean that, if he didn't die on the battlefield, he'd be able to enjoy life a little longer. On the other hand, Laura was quick to admit that her life's goal was to find her lost sister. But she didn't want to say any more, and clearly wanted to carry the weight of this mission alone. Maxime, not wishing to rush things, moved on to another subject, and as time went by, the discussion passed very naturally between them. Their laughter echoed through the festive evening, and noticing their complicity, no one disturbed the two lovebirds during the evening. Time passed quickly, and then somehow what had to happen did, but Maxime couldn't remember how they'd ended up in that hammock. With the flashback ending here, Maxime remained confused, but now he wondered how to interact with this woman in the future. Suddenly, a slight movement was felt on his chest. Looking down, he met her light green, almost emerald eyes. Her eyes seemed to reflect the sweetness and depth of his soul. Maxime felt his heart beat faster, as if he'd found something important to him. "I'll protect you," Maxime declared softly. Laura blinked slightly, as if trying to understand both Maxime's words and what she was doing here. After a few seconds, she remembered many things. "Fuck you, Maxime, I don't need your protection," Laura replied firmly, her eyes menacing. The mood changed so suddenly that Maxime found himself speechless. Then he laughed so loudly that it woke up many of the mercenaries who had taken the earth as their mattress and the sky as their blanket. Hearing this laughter, the mercenaries cast knowing glances at each other. "The chief and Laura must have had a lot of fun last night," said one of them with a mischievous grin. "The chef and the chefette you mean now, haha." "Chefette or not, it makes no difference to us, either way she was far too strong for us to dare answer her," said a former bandit with a laugh. Peter grinned, having spent the night out too.
Next to him was James.
The relationship between them had grown closer during the evening, and they had even sworn an oath to become brothers. "Surely only the chief is worthy of Laura here," James added, looking up at the sky. While gossip was going on outside the grotto, Maxime finally finished his giggle. "What's got into you?" asked Laura softly with surprised eyes. "Nothing, it's just, you're perfect, don't change a thing," Maxime replied with a smile. Laura also smiled in response. "Just, do you know how we ended up in that hammock? I have hazy memories of that part of the evening." Laura blinked innocently several times. "No, absolutely no idea." She said nothing more. For her the experience of the evening before was also a first for her. But unlike Maxime, she remembered everything, and for the part about the hammock, she was mischievous and didn't wish to reveal the truth of what had happened. Strange, Maxime thought, but didn't dwell on it. A few hours passed, during which Maxime and Laura talked about everything and nothing. Their laughter could sometimes be heard by the mercenaries, children and women outside the cave. But unlike them, everyone began to work. Some went off to cut down some trees to start building the huts, others made food, and a few washed their clothes and armor in a nearby river. Izo, who was normally an extremely discreet person, never revealing his emotions, showed a certain talent for storytelling by teaching the children some important information about the outside world. And he did so with energy and vigor, eliciting a few amused and surprised glances from the Quessois mercenaries who had known him for some time. For the children, this information was something extremely new, and they listened attentively with starry eyes. These children, who had almost always grown up in the cave, knew for the first time what life was really like, and some even began to daydream. "Uncle Izo, do you think I could ever become a royal knight?" asked a shy 8-year-old. The other children also listened attentively. Even some of the mercenaries had fun listening to Izo's stories while working.
"Good question."
"I couldn't tell you myself, since I've never been to the capital," Izo replied with a smile. All the stories he told were simply what he'd already heard from the villagers of Quessois, as well as what he'd heard recently when traveling with the saber-toothed tigers. "However, what I know for sure is that as long as you follow the chief for part of your life and remain loyal to him, you can become absolutely anything you want." Speaking of Maxime, Izo's eyes filled with admiration. He firmly believed that in this world, nothing could stop Maxime from reaching the top. Of course, all this was on condition that he survived by his side for a few years, but he wouldn't tell children such details. What these children needed right now was hope for the future that awaited them. Izo also wanted them to stop worrying about going hungry and being captured at any moment by evildoers. The sun soon showed that it was time for lunch, and everyone happily made their way to the few pots filled with food. The atmosphere was excellent, with everyone eating together, talking and laughing. Maxime and Laura also joined them towards the end of the meal, prompting curious and mischievous eyes from the mercenaries. Naturally, they arrived dressed in light armor. Somehow, Laura remembered where their clothes were, which prompted a few questions from Maxime, but she managed to avoid them with some ingenuity. At the end of the meal, Maxime stood up with a serious face.
"Good morning, everyone. I hope you had a pleasant night."
Hearing this couldn't help but cast curious glances at Maxime. Noticing these glances, Maxime quickly moved on, coughing slightly. "In less than an hour I'll be leaving with Andrew, Rodrigo, Ernest, Pietro and Terry for the town of Hippocamp to meet Baron Irit. We'll probably stay there for a few days. During that time, everyone will be under Romuald's direction. When we return, I hope there will be some progress. By the same token, I'd like to welcome our new comrades to our mercenary group." On hearing these words, the former mercenaries applauded the arrival of the former bandits. Some even whistled to add a little atmosphere. The new mercenaries seemed happy to be joining Maxime's group, especially after noticing that certain constraints on their bodies seemed to have disappeared and that their training would be several times more effective in the future. Maxime continued to talk for a few minutes, getting things organized before he left. Once the meal was over, and everyone was back to their duties, Maxime equipped himself for the departure to Hippocamp. Andrew, Rodrigo, Ernest, Pietro and Terry also geared up, ready to leave at a moment's notice. "Alright guys, are you ready?"
Everyone nodded.
The moment having come, Maxime went to kiss Laura discreetly and quickly under the amused gazes of his fellow passengers. Then they set off together for the town of Hippocamp. It was 80 kilometers to the city, but with their exceptional physique and the fact that they were traveling light, Maxime had planned to arrive in the evening. In the forest, they ran slowly due to the vegetation and lack of visibility, but once out, they could simply take the beaten dirt roads created for transporting goods between the various villages and towns. This way, when they saw a small band of 6 armed men traveling light, no one dared stop them. As the moon shone down on the world, Maxime and his comrades reached the top of the hill just opposite the town's entrance. From where they stood, the mercenaries could see the thick stone ramparts surrounding the town, a vestige of the days when cities defended themselves against invaders,
whether human or not.
Ahead of them, the dirt road led up to the main gate, massive and made of dark wood, barred with fittings rusted by the years. On either side of the entrance, round towers stood with a few torch-bearing soldiers, watching for the slightest suspicious movement outside. The cool evening wind brought with it the scent of damp earth and wood fires, a familiar aroma to Maxime's companions. From their vantage point, the faint sounds of nightlife could be heard. The muffled sound of conversation in the taverns, the distant neighing of horses in the stables, and occasionally, the metallic clink of an anvil, perhaps from a blacksmith working late. They made their way down towards the town, and soon arrived not far from the town's entrance gate. At this hour there wasn't much traffic, so the 6 men were quickly spotted by the soldiers. As they approached within a few meters of the gate, a dozen soldiers intercepted them. Among them, a soldier stepped forward and greeted them. "Welcome to the town of Hippocamp. May we know the reason for your visit?" Maxime advanced towards the soldier, while his men remained at their position. "We've come here to meet Baron Irit." The soldiers were surprised, and their leader whispered something in the ear of one of them, who immediately ran off. He returned 30 seconds later and whispered something to the soldier's leader. The latter seemed surprised. "We've confirmed your identities. You can go back to town, but please remember not to disturb the peace, otherwise we'll be forced to intervene and apply the corresponding sanctions." As he said this, the leader looked slightly menacing. Maxime's face looked a little grim at being threatened in such a way when he'd been invited here in the first place.
But he held his breath. "We understand. Let's go, guys."
Maxime walked through the crowd of soldiers without giving them another glance, but Andrew and Rodrigo cast cold glances at them. Of course, they said nothing that might aggravate the situation. After all, they were on someone else's territory, and they'd come here to do important business. So no one wanted to spoil things. They headed straight for the Baron's residence, but as they didn't know where it was, they asked the locals they met along the way for directions as they went along. It deserved to be the capital of a baron's territory, and even though it was night, the town was far from quiet. The taverns, scattered throughout the town, formed the epicenter of a certain nocturnal effervescence. Maxime passed a tavern called Les Chasseurs de Soufs, located near the main square in the center of town. Its large solid wooden tables covered with delicious dishes, Mugs of mead and spiced wine seemed particularly appealing to those mercenaries who had been traveling for a long time. Loud laughter and bawdy singing could always be heard, while the waitresses moved skillfully between the customers. Maxime glanced at his comrades and said, "Well-deserved rest, let's take a walk and fill our stomachs." Everyone was happy to hear these words. Indeed, after running for over 6 hours, they were all starving. Their peculiar clothes and bad smell drew disgruntled glances from some customers. But when they saw their weapons strapped to their waists, no one said anything and the party went on.
A waitress greeted them.
"Welcome, dear hunters, there are 6 of you, correct?" Maxime nodded, and the waitress led them to a table that had just been vacated by a few customers.
"So what would you like?" asked the waitress.
"Bring a dozen of your dishes, please," replied Maxime, without bothering to look at the menu. A dozen dishes for 6 people might seem like a lot, but even Terry, who had the weakest physique, was considered strong among elite soldiers. Their bodies demanded a lot of energy, not to mention the fact that they had already exerted themselves on the way. They were soon served several delicious dishes by a couple of waitresses. "Bon appetit, dear customers," one of them said softly with a big smile before heading back to the kitchen. As he ate, Maxime discreetly asked, "So, guys, what do you think about getting involved in this business?" Obviously, Maxime wasn't going to mention Baron Irit's name on his turf.
Andrew stopped eating.
"I've been thinking a lot about the meaning of becoming a mercenary since I joined you, and I think the very meaning of a mercenary group is to wage war, no matter what side you're on." Rodrigo and Ernest nodded as well. "I'll speak for Rodrigo too, as we've already discussed it a little, but for us it's a wise decision. It's only in this kind of conflict that the group can grow further and we can gain in renown," declared Ernest as he continued to eat delicately. Maxime nodded and looked at Pietro and Terry.
Terry spoke first.
"For us, Maxime, it's like you're giving us a second life, because if you hadn't passed through our village, we'd have died that day like everyone else."
Pietro nodded and added,
"We'll follow you in everything you do." Maxime was somewhat relieved to hear these words. After all, he alone had decided the fate of some 60 people by taking them to war. After talking about the subject for a while, they began to tell a few anecdotes about what had happened last night. Maxime was also treated to a few mischievous jokes from his men. As they continued to laugh, eat and drink in good spirits, a group of people burst into the tavern. But Maxime and his men didn't notice the movement and carried on talking and laughing. "What the hell do you mean there's no more room?" shouted a bald man with a long scar on his face. The waitress was intimidated. "I'm sorry, but at the moment we're fully booked. Feel free to come back later." The bald man and his friends didn't seem satisfied and scanned the tavern with their eyes. He quickly noticed some unfamiliar faces at the back of the tavern. 6 young men, one with blonde hair, another with blue hair and yet another with red hair. There was also one young man who looked particularly short and skinny. Only the remaining 2 looked particularly strong, but for the bald man they were the perfect targets. Without hesitation, he advanced towards Maxime's table, jostling the waitress and knocking her to the floor. "Move over, this is our table now." Behind the bald man, a few of the women accompanying the group of men seemed very excited by the situation as she laughed and mocked the group of young men. "Hey, look, Samantha, do you think they escaped from their parents' house?" "Haha, I don't know, but from the looks of their young faces Auda is going to have a field day with them." "Oh, stop laughing at them, girls, otherwise when they get home they'll be traumatized," exclaimed a third woman, laughing shamelessly too. The women's laughter echoed around the tavern, which had fallen silent since the waitress had fallen to the floor. It made Auda's face proud and happy. He loved being the center of attention. Maxime finally looked up at the troublemakers. Seeing Auda and his friends' faces and the waitress on the floor, Maxime sighed slightly. "I'll be right back." With that sentence out of the way, Maxime rose from his wooden chair. "Oh, the young man is angry," Auda commented, laughing loudly. However, the next moment his face suddenly turned red as he lost all sensation of weightlessness. The young man in front of him had lifted him with one hand and was crushing his throat. Without waiting, he was slapped repeatedly by the left hand of the blond young man in front of him. "That's for disturbing the atmosphere in the tavern." "This one's for pushing our waitress." "This is for disturbing my meal." "This one's for me giving you lessons." "And this one's just for fun, because it's kind of nice." Seeing the bald man begin to lose consciousness, Maxime finally let go after a few seconds. The latter was unable to stand, and sprawled on the floor before the astonished eyes of the tavern's guests. At the same time, Auda's friends noticed the sword hanging from Maxime's waist. "Shit, we just ran into a badass."
"Let's go, boys."
Without delay, they left the tavern carrying Auta with them. Maxime shook his head and sat back down at the table. He continued to eat and drink, but his good mood had been spoiled and the food didn't taste the same. Andrew, Terry, Ernest, Rodrigo and Pietro seemed equally affected. They left the tavern a few minutes later, under the curious gaze of the remaining guests and the sound of low masses. Outside, a fresh breeze greeted Maxime and his comrades, positively cheering their mood. There should still be time to go and see the Baron, let's go boys. But as soon as Maxime finished his sentence, a team of soldiers came towards them. Being in the town's main square, many people were attracted by the movement.
Halt.
Hearing these firm words, Maxime really began to lose his patience. Guys, I think I'm going to lose it. Hearing these words, Andrew and the others looked at each other, then nodded in agreement. They stepped forward in front of Maxime, offering only their backs for their leader's view. We told you not to cause trouble, and less than 2 hours later I hear you've suffocated a man in a tavern. The chief guard at the city gate was surprisingly here. Enough chatter, our chief was provoked and he simply retaliated. We're off to see the Baron now, don't bother us, Andrew replied in a tone that left no room for negotiation. The chief of the guard was stunned. He knew these people had to go to the Baron, but no matter how important the matter, they were just mercenaries, weren't they? To him, mercenaries were just cannon fodder in the face of the might of knights and nobility. Stay here. We'll take you to the public security station. He was rather pleased when he said this, despite his firm face. He thought that by acting this way, he would improve the Baron's image and authority in an indirect way. I'd advise against it, Andrew replied simply. He glanced at Maxime behind him, who was looking increasingly impatient. Keep stopping us, and you won't be able to see daybreak tomorrow, Andrew continued. Unfortunately, the head of the guard didn't seem to want to hear anything. Instead, he seemed very annoyed that his own authority was being challenged. Stop them immediately. Use force if necessary, shouted the chief guard to the 20 men accompanying him. The latter immediately ran towards the saber-toothed tigers. Try not to kill them, Andrew simply advised the others, before rushing towards the guards. Okay, Vice Captain, replied Ernest with slight annoyance. This kind of thing is really boring, added Rodrigo, shaking his head. They don't realize they've just escaped death, yet they still come here, sighed Terry. It makes you wonder how they've managed to keep their heads on their shoulders until now, commented Pietro, quickly rolling his eyes while doing some stretching. Seconds later, everyone began to fight. Andrew simply ran up to 2 random guards, grabbed one on each side and tackled them to the ground. These 2 guards experienced for the first time a tackle made with the strength of an apprentice knight, and spat blood as they hit the ground. Andrew quickly got to his feet and kicked some nearby guards. Ernest was more restrained, relying instead on his agility and using a few small techniques to knock his opponents to the ground. Terry was more mischievous, getting the soldiers in each other's way before sending in a few quick jabs. Despite his diminutive stature, Terry had the explosive power of an elite soldier. Each flippant blow was like a fist sent full power by an ordinary adult. Pietro didn't bother to dodge the blows. He picked up a guard and threw him at several of his comrades. They all fell to the ground confused. Rodrigo played much more violently, throwing straight punches with all his might. With the 3rd guard still on the ground after a single movement, the other guards took fright. What, that's it? Even an old man over 70 is more courageous and robust than you, Rodrigo laughed. Of course, he was thinking of Organ, who had stayed at the camp. Within 30 seconds, some 15 soldiers were on the ground, and the remaining 5 stayed by the head guard's side, fearing they'd end up like their colleagues. Chief, these mercenaries are far too strong for us, whispered one of the soldiers discreetly. Fear could still be seen in his eyes. The man in charge of the guards was equally intimidated and didn't know how to react. Feeling the stares of all the citizens, shopkeepers and storytellers present in the public square, the head of the guards felt his face burn. Dad! Hearing the familiar cry, he breathed a sigh of relief. Henry, you're just in time. Your father has met with some evildoers, can you help me subdue them? A cocky-looking young man, wearing a light knight's outfit with a sword hanging from his waist approached. When he'd turned 15, he'd been given the chance to test his knightly talent, and it turned out he did indeed have it. Although it was only a low-level talent, it came dangerously close to the middle level. This made him a minor genius within the barony. Wow, that's Henry. Henry. Don't you know him? They say he's one of the few talents who could become a knight within the next 10 years. The crowd gathered more and more, watching the excitement. Henry had indeed lived up to the expectations of the Baron and the knights, and had just recently broken through to the rank of apprentice knight. He planned to celebrate with his friends. Just then, He saw his father and his men in trouble against a small group of mercenaries. With his strength and that of his 4 friends, he was confident he could help his father. After all, among them was even an apprentice knight in the early stages of success. The rest were also strong men, all training to become apprentice knights. They far exceeded the strength of a standard elite soldier. Of course, Dad, as an apprentice knight, my duty is also to ensure the public safety of the territory. The head guard breathed a sigh of relief, then threatened Andrew and the others. I advise you to kneel down immediately and apologize. He threatened immediately. But Andrew and the others didn't budge an inch. Maxime remained behind without saying a word, his face impassive. But he himself knew how much he was holding back his anger at that moment. Henry, seeing that the criminals weren't cooperating, lunged straight at Ernest and sent a kick towards his face. But to his surprise, the ordinary mercenary easily blocked the kick. Good power, Ernest commented with surprise. Henry seemed equally surprised. Clearly, this blue-haired man was listening to the red-haired man's orders. So the red-haired man could only be stronger. Unconsciously, everyone ignored Maxime behind them. Soon, all the young men found their opponents and began to fight. Surprisingly, the fight was fairly evenly balanced on both sides. There were 2 apprentice knights on each side and 3 powerful elite soldiers. The mercenaries' skills had been honed thanks to a very powerful talent, a little training and above all some real fighting. But the aspiring knights were not to be outdone. Long years of training combined with a certain talent and excellent fighting techniques could only make them strong. They obviously lacked combat experience, but that made the strength of both sides similar. And so, as time went by, blood began to flow on the ground as the fight became more and more violent. The head of the guard was full of confidence at first, but as time went on he began to grow anxious. Shit, who did I provoke? That outa brat kicked an iron plate there. Mercenaries that strong having to meet the Baron at this hour probably have some reputation and good strength. If it turns out it's only a tiny part of the mercenary group, but I've offended them, so even if all goes well with the Baron, I'm going to have problems of my own. Finally, the noise of the crowd and the fighting was so loud that it attracted one of the most powerful people in the territory. Knight Jack.
Stop at once.
When Henry and his friends heard this loud, powerful voice covering the entire square, they stopped immediately out of habit. But the saber-toothed tigers didn't, and all seized the opportunity to strike a powerful blow at each of their opponents. Henry was stunned and fell to his knees in front of Ernest after an uppercut to the chin. For a few moments, his thoughts literally stopped. When he opened his eyes again, the tip of a sword was right in front of his throat. All his friends were found in a similar situation. I think you should mind your own business next time, Ernest said, addressing Henry. Take advantage of our moment of inattention, you have no honor, exclaimed Henry angrily. Because when your father mobilizes a score of soldiers to look after 6 young men, that's honorable. And when the 6 young men manage to defend themselves, 2 apprentice knights and 4 elite soldiers attack them too, that's honorable too. When Ernest noted the facts, he had a very mocking, ironic face as he looked out over the crowd. At this point, it was almost becoming a spectacle. Everybody get out of here. That loud, powerful voice returned with renewed intensity. Knight Jack finally made his appearance. He was dressed very lightly, but it showed his strong build at a glance. A huge sword could be seen hanging from his back. Next to him, even the impressively muscular Rodrigo and Pietro looked like children. He first passed the head of the guard and arrived not far from Ernest and Andrew, who still had their swords pointed at the apprentice knights. Their expressions were extremely serious as they watched this strong man appear. Although he didn't know who it was, the pressure he exuded simply by being there was enormous. It was as if this man had reached a higher stage of life. Sheath your swords, young men, this is no place to fight, he ordered firmly. Finally, Maxime could take no more.
I beg your pardon?
This is no place to fight, he said, stepping ahead of his mercenaries for the first time and positioning himself less than a meter from Chevalier Jack. Yes, it's not a place for. But Jack was immediately interrupted. No, at some point you've got to shut your big mouth and take note, shouted Maxime angrily. First of all, we were threatened by that chief guard when we entered the town as guests of Baron Irit. It's you who need the strength of our mercenary group, not the other way around. At this point, Maxime was full of anger. He already had little patience for this kind of thing, but events happened one after the other, causing him to lose patience. But seeing a commoner speak to him in that tone, Chevalier Jack also got angry and wanted to express himself.
No, but...
And he was interrupted again by Maxime.
No. You shut your fucking big mouth, knight.
Because it's because of your laxity that after that, we were disturbed during our meal in the tavern, which spoiled the end of our meal. Then your damned guards pissed us off again by threatening us without asking our side of the story. Once my men were back on the ground, your aspiring knights came to attack us. And now you think you're the boss and can settle the situation calmly? I'm going to show the world here that our saber-toothed tigers are not easily intimidated even by noblemen. Seeing this combination of circumstances, Maxime even thought that Baron Irat had planned everything and was testing his mercenary group. The crowd was completely shocked by this development, but at the same time extremely admiring. In this world, respect for knights and noblemen was deeply rooted. No one would even think of going against them unless they had noble status. If they didn't, they'd have a cold body the next day. But Maxime couldn't care less at this stage. He had his own character and he didn't care about the consequences as long as he kept his spine straight. He knew he could count on his latest enhancements and talent to make a killing if Baron Irat's men really went too far. Knight Jack drew his sword, his face seething with anger. The sword was over a meter wide and at least 2 meters long. But this move was a mistake in Maxime's eyes. After all I've said, he still dares to draw his sword? The status of knights is really too high in this world, Maxime thought. The next moment he murmured, "Nox limit." A surge of energy ran through his body and he wanted to escape in all directions. But somehow Maxime managed to channel this energy solely into his body. Then as his eyes turned white he lunged at extreme speed towards Chevalier Jack. The short meter of distance between the two figures was as if non-existent as Maxime struck a physical blow of an astonishing 4.5 points. Chevalier Jack only had time to activate his vital seed, which instantly strengthened his physique. But unfortunately, it wasn't enough. He had underestimated Maxime far too much. If he'd known that this discreet young man with blonde hair was so strong, he'd never have left such an obvious opening. "Fuck you, Ron, you didn't tell me this guy could be so strong and fast." These were Jack's last thoughts before his imposing body was sent flying by Maxime's punch, which had landed right in his face. Henry and his fellow apprentice knight were able to catch a glimpse of Maxime punching Jack. It sent violent shivers through their bodies. Their life's goal, their idol, their motivation to get up every day and train, had just been sent flying by a single punch from a man younger than them. Worst of all, they had provoked this young man. Their spirits were shattered as they shivered with fear. This young man was so crazy that they could kill them right here. The crowd was in disarray. "Shit, did you see that? What the hell? Knight Jack has just been sent robbed by a stranger?" Maxime remained standing in the middle of the square, his men still pointing their swords at the aspiring knights crouching on the ground. The scene seemed chaotic, with soldiers still on the ground around them. Yet, looking at this young man with blonde hair and white eyes exuding an invisible aura of power, some of them had stars in their eyes. It was as if they were witnessing the birth of a future legend. The scene seemed chaotic, with soldiers still on the ground around them. Yet, looking at this young man with blonde hair and white eyes exuding an invisible aura of power, some of them had stars in their eyes. It was as if they were witnessing the birth of a future legend. Jack was on the ground, about 10 meters from Maxime. Lifting his head with difficulty, everything blurred as he tried to look at Maxime. The energy of his vital seed moved quickly through his body and into his head. After a few seconds, he felt a gentle warmth in his face. His eyesight quickly recovered, and he was able to stand up again a few moments later. Seeing this scene, Maxime silently deactivated his talent. He didn't think it was necessary to activate his talent any longer. Indeed, knights have become a species apart. This regeneration ability is truly enviable, Maxime thought silently. Simultaneously, an incredible wave of weakness swept through his body, and he almost fell to his knees. Activating Nox limit twice is indeed a little too hard for my body. He knew he'd receive a backlash for activating his talent twice, but he didn't think it would be this bad. Yet he'd somehow managed to reduce the talent's consumption by preventing it from escaping to his mercenaries. But with his current control over his talent, it was still too hard and the loss of energy was still immense. Now he felt that with his body, even an ordinary adult could defeat it. Meanwhile, Jack stood up as if nothing had happened. Despite his weakness, Maxime used his acting skills and remained calm. But the anger in Jack's eyes could be seen by the entire crowd in the square. He approached step by step, exuding an extremely powerful coercion. Maxime looked at him quietly. "If need be, I'll activate my talent a third time." A dangerous glint appeared in Maxime's eyes. He knew full well that if he activated his talent a third time, even if only for a short time, his lifespan would be permanently shortened. But Maxime was determined. Knight Jack returned to his previous position, but this time extremely vigilant in the face of Maxime. He also saw the dangerous gleam in Maxime's eyes. "Tell your men to sheathe their swords." The fight's over for tonight. As he said this, the coercion he exuded disappeared. Jack's words surprised Maxime, making him doubt his intentions. But after a moment's reflection, Maxime looked at his mercenaries and beckoned them to obey. As soon as he was free, Henry quickly escaped behind Jack.
Professor, avenge us now.
Their leader is obviously not a knight, you'll only make mincemeat of him. Jack tapped Henry lightly on the head, signaling him to be quiet. I'll take that punch as compensation for the disruption you've had today in our town. I sincerely hope you'll be able to help our territory out of this complicated situation. Of course, these words were spoken in a low voice, so that only those nearby could hear. Knight Jack then departed, watched by a stunned chief of guard in the distance and the aspiring knights. Quickly, the aspiring knights and soldiers still standing carried off their comrades, who were groaning painfully on the ground.
Captain.
Andrew was worried for his leader. So were the others, equally at a loss for what to do.
It's all right.
It's only a small event. But we'll postpone our visit to Baron Irit. Let's find a good inn and get some sleep. After Maxime's explanation, his mercenaries nodded. It didn't take them long to find an inn, pay 6 pieces of silver for the night and the morning meal. It was already getting late, and with all that had happened in just 2 days, they were all tired and went straight to bed. The crowd didn't dare approach Maxime and his mercenaries either. So they went back to partying in the nearby taverns. They chatted about recent events. In this isolated little town, interesting things rarely happened, so even ordinary events over 10 years old could still be a topic of conversation here. So what happened between these young mercenaries and the town soldiers spread very quickly. The very next morning, Baron Irit was interrupted during his breakfast, which was surprisingly conventional and not very luxurious. Baron, sorry to disturb you, but I've got some important news. Baron Irit, who was in his 40s and had an unshaven beard, looked up at a young soldier. Feeling the gaze full of vicissitudes and deep but also imbued with a certain kindness, the young soldier took a deep breath and then began to recount the events. Hearing that a young mercenary and his men had beaten to the ground his soldiers and even aspiring knights, including 2 apprentices, Baron Irit's expression didn't change much. He didn't even bother to stop eating. He'd guessed the identity of these young mercenaries from the report provided by Chevalier Ron. But when it came to the part of the story where Maxime lost control and started to get white eyes, the Baron's expression changed for the first time. And when he heard that this young man had sent a right so powerful that Knight Jack lost consciousness for a moment, Baron Irit immediately stood up. What did you say? Knight Jack lost consciousness? Baron Irit seemed particularly excited. Yes, Lord, but he got up quickly, added the young soldier hastily. Interesting, very interesting indeed, commented the Baron, sitting back down quietly. Eve. Eve being the young soldier's first name. Tell the men to start the work we discussed immediately. Yes, Seigneur, replied Eve, bowing gently. Oh, and tell them that if they finish ahead of schedule, everyone will receive a bonus of 50% of their pay. Eve's expression appeared astonished, but he obeyed at once. I'm off to instruct them in the Lord's orders, he replied immediately before leaving. In a much more modest part of town, Maxime and his men ate breakfast in the tavern. Observing the curious yet intimidated expressions of the inn's other occupants, Andrew shook his head. You sure made a lot of noise in town last night, boss, he said, obviously mocking.
Nonsense,
replied Maxime, raising his eyes slightly. The other mercenaries were amused. Just look at the way the waiter's hands are shaking when he serves us, it's so funny, exclaimed Peter, laughing loudly. I don't know if you've noticed, but the owner of the inn can't stop looking at us all the time, added Pietro mysteriously. Ha ha ha, did you see it too? And clearly, as soon as we look at him too, he immediately turns his head away, obviously embarrassed at being caught in the act, continued Rodrigo, also laughing. But Maxime wasn't in the mood. Ernest noticed and asked him, You're not well, Chief? What's on your mind? The mercenaries' laughter quietly stopped, then looked at their visibly worried leader. No, I'm trying to guess to what extent our actions last night will affect our negotiations with the Baron. Ernest smiled accordingly, which questioned Maxime. You worry too much, Chief, we'll go and see how it goes. The other mercenaries nodded as well. If not, in the worst-case scenario, we'll ravage the Baron's mansion, Andrew commented with a smile. All the mercenaries looked at him for a moment before laughing loudly. Maxime laughed too. What was so funny? It was the fact that this situation, which at first seemed like a joke, could after a certain period of reflection become reality. Indeed, if Maxime's talent could be fully exercised, anyone could increase their stats by 50% for 30 minutes. Maxime could have the strength of a senior knight wielding a sword, while Andrew and Ernest could barely reach the level of a newly minted knight. Rodrigo, Pietro and Peter would all have the strength of an apprentice knight at the peak stage. Of course, no one knew the knight's hidden assets and therefore their actual strength. But taking into account only the physical strength of the mercenaries and knights, they could really ransack the mansion. But not to mention the events that might follow, they all knew that Maxime could no longer activate his talent without irreversible consequences. So it really was a joke for now. They continued talking and laughing undisturbed. Once their bellies were full, Maxime stood up and said with a smile, "Come on guys, let's go see the Baron and see what happens."
Yes, sir.
Their cries startled the other guests, but no one dared say anything. Once their backs were turned, the atmosphere in the inn changed completely. It was as if everyone felt less pressure on their shoulders. As they walked, they discovered the atmosphere of a thriving medieval town, which seemed to make Hippocamp a totally different place from last night. The sun rose above the ramparts, illuminating the thatched and slate roofs of the houses huddled together. The cobbled streets, winding and often narrow, quickly filled with merchants, craftsmen and busy townsfolk. The steady clatter of hooves on stone, mingled with the creaking of horse or ox-drawn carts, echoed through the streets. But this effervescence mixed with the fresh morning air made walking through the city a pleasant experience. Passing back into the center of town, in the large market square, the scene was particularly lively. Wooden stalls, covered in colorful linens, lined up in tight rows. Vendors shouted to sell their wares, addressing passers-by in loud voices, extolling the virtues of their wares: fresh fruit, vegetables, fabrics, pottery, medicinal herbs and other indispensable commodities. The air was filled with the scent of freshly baked bread, spices from faraway lands and smoke from butchers' and fishmongers' stalls. The bright colors of the vegetables and fruit contrasted with the dull, worn clothes of the peasants who came to sell their produce, their faces burnished by working under the sun. The little mercenary troop passed by, observing the excitement of a medieval town. "Hey boy, would you like some fruit in the morning?" shouted a merchant selling fruit. The voice caught Maxime's eye. Glancing around, he saw a middle-aged man with deep wrinkles, but smiling brightly. He was obviously selling various types of fruit from his stand. Normally you can have any fruit you like for 1 bronze coin, but because you look rather nice, you can have 5 for only 4 bronze coins. Maxime shook his head and continued forward with his men. The salesman, seeing Maxime's peculiar attire, and in particular his sword, didn't insist any further. Instead, several citizens who had heard the vendor's special offer came to his stand and began bargaining for the 5 fruits for 4 bronze coins. 10 minutes later, Maxime and his men arrived at the Baron's gate. Without much ado, 2 men dressed as servants opened the gate for them. At the same time, the 2 men motioned for them to follow. Entering the Baron's residence, they first discovered the gardens. Surprisingly, the flowers had lost their color and the different species were blending into one another. The various trees growing in the garden had clearly not been pruned for a long time, and simply grew naturally. Dead leaves covered the gravelly ground. A fountain stood in the middle of the gardens, but as Maxime and his men approached it, they discovered that it had long since dried up. Weeds had broken through the fountain's stone floor and were beginning to proliferate at the bottom of the fountain. In the distance, at the top of the steps leading up to the Baron's mansion, a man dressed as an ordinary civilian keeping his arms behind his back, as well as a man in full armor could be seen by Maxime and his men. They climbed the steps and arrived in front of these 2 people. "I take it this is our young hero Maxime, whom we have the honor of meeting?" asked the plain-clothed man with some eloquence. Maxime didn't think he'd be directly placed at such a height and was surprised, but outwardly he simply flashed a smile. "My men are my real strength," Maxime replied simply. "Chevalier Ron, we meet again," Maxime continued, this time looking at the man in armor. The latter removed his helmet. "As expected, I couldn't hide for long," laughed Ron after removing his helmet. "In that case, I take it you're Baron Iret?" questioned Maxime, looking at the middle-aged man with the unshaven beard. "Welcome to my town of Hippocamp," retorted the Baron, extending his hand towards Maxime. Maxime didn't hesitate and shook the Baron's hand. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Lord Iret." The Baron laughed lightly. Lord is a big word for a simple Baron. Stopping their handshake, the Baron invited Maxime and his men into the manor. The interior of the manor was similar to the garden. It was in a dilapidated state, but the various works of art hanging on the walls, as well as the armor and swords decorating the manor, kept a last trace of the glorious times the manor had known. Baron Iret noticed the strange looks on the mercenaries' faces. This was also rather obvious, since it wasn't the first time it had happened. Who could believe that a baron would have such a miserable garden and mansion? Various incidents have come and gone in recent years, dealing a devastating blow to the barony's economy. Now most of the tax money is invested in training aspiring knights. After the Baron's explanation, Maxime and his men understood the situation slightly better. The Baron led them into a small room where a large round wooden table sat, surrounded by exactly 9 wooden chairs. A large map of the region had been placed in the center of the table. "Please be seated, everyone." The Baron sat at one end of the table, while Maxime sat at the other. Chevalier Ron took his place to the right of the Baron, while the mercenaries sat closest to Maxime. This left one last chair to the Baron's left. Simultaneously, a noise was heard at the door. Knight Jack requests permission for the Lord to enter. "Don't be so courteous," enter Jack. An imposing man in armor entered the room and sat down next to the Baron. Maxime inhaled slightly.
Before him stood 3 knights. They were 3 knights.
Together, these 3 individuals could undoubtedly face an army of 100 soldiers head-on and exterminate them without a care. They represented the immense gulf the nobility had built up between themselves and ordinary civilians. With their bodies and vital seed, they were immune to most poisons. Not to mention their reaction speed and physical strength, which rendered any assassination attempt by ordinary people completely useless. Without Nox limit, Maxime and his men could be killed in less than a dozen breaths if these 3 men were to act. So Maxime, when you spoke with Ron, you said you'd be willing to intervene in the war with Baron Barton for 800 gold pieces and enough lodging to house and feed 200 people. You also wanted a field big enough to train that many people. Not to mention that you wanted the land to be in your name. When Baron Iret spoke directly about this affair, Maxime didn't have the same confidence as when he discussed it with Chevalier Ron. Not to mention the passive intimidation conferred by the presence of 3 knights on him, the simple aura of this casually dressed middle-aged man was not something Maxime could bear. It was the aura of someone long accustomed to power. For his part, Maxime was still an ordinary high school student working hard to earn a watch just over 2 months ago. But recent experiences combined with a natural leadership temperament meant that Maxime only needed a moment to calm down. Yes, and it's a price accepted in the context of Baron Barton offending my mercenary group. Otherwise we wouldn't be here talking to you. On hearing Maxime's words, Chevalier Ron smiled slightly, while Chevalier Jack frowned. "Indeed, calves aren't afraid of tigers," murmured Jack. "But it's been proven that even tigers can lose their claws if they're not careful," replied Ron, looking at Jack. Iret obviously didn't care about the little altercation between his knights. Instead, he looked Maxime directly in the eye. "To be honest, your mercenary group is still too weak to deserve such a prize. Especially since in our situation, it's complicated to be able to get out so much money and manpower." Iret's words made Maxime doubt.
What's he getting at? He thought.
"But for a magical talent like yours, Maxime, I'm willing to make an effort. However, I need to know its effects first before I can do anything." Ron and Jack also stopped their visual confrontation and looked strangely at Maxime. Baron Iret bent his waist and leaned back against the table, moving slightly closer to Maxime. "So tell me, Maxime, what's your talent?" The situation became particularly tense when this question was asked. Whether in this world or in the real world, talents are considered secrets. So any question on the subject is generally perceived as highly disrespectful unless the person belongs to very close family. Maxime and Iret had just met. But Iret hadn't finished his questions, even though he was very curious. What is this talent that can allow a brat like you to possess such fighting power at such a young age? What talent makes it possible to have so many talented people in a small mercenary group? The mercenaries' faces turned very dark. Asking so many questions could be enough to make mortal enemies. Andrew pounded his fist on the table, which resonated particularly loudly in the room. "We're not here to be interrogated," Andrew declared coolly. "That's right, excuse me, my curiosity got the better of me," replied Iret lightly, smiling. Iret straightened up, then revealed his initial objective. "I'm keen to invest in a band as talented as yours, so we'll respond to your requests."
Maxime nodded.
"As for the accommodation..." Maxime didn't have time to finish as Iret cut him off. "Don't worry, the construction of your homes has already begun," announced Iret, as if everything were under his control. Maxime was pleasantly surprised. "Well, thanks."
"You're welcome.
Now let's talk about the plan of attack." Everyone focused on the map spread out on the table. "Our Hippocamp city is here, 80 kilometers west of the ancient Quessois village. Itak, the Baron's town, is here, 60 kilometers north of Quessois. Between our 2 towns, there must be approximately 70 kilometers to cover as well as a dozen villages." Everyone listened attentively, even Ron and Jack had a solemn expression. In this plan, they were also putting their lives on the line. No one took their own lives lightly. Irit continued to speak. 4 of these villages are under my jurisdiction. The problem remains the other 6 villages, which are Baron Barthan's responsibility. These villages serve as his control tower. So, if we send troops, there's more than a 90% chance they'll be discovered before they reach Itak. Once discovered, the surprise attack effect will be lost and we won't be able to defeat Baron Barthan quickly. And if we don't defeat him quickly, Baron Kenepes will take the opportunity to steal some of our villages. Despite his scruffy appearance, Baron Irit's expression was very serious, as he clearly explained the military situation on both sides. Maxime listened attentively, but he had absolutely no knowledge of military strategy, so he didn't really understand what needed to be done. Let's get down to business. Where and when should my mercenaries intervene? Irit smiled slightly. I was getting to that. An iron mine has been discovered precisely 20 kilometers from Hippocamp and about 50 kilometers from Itak. The news Irit dropped was surprising. An iron mine could easily generate sales of over 500 gold coins a year. Counting expenses and taxes, net profit could still reach 450 gold coins. This revenue would undoubtedly allow Irit to get its head above water and breathe a sigh of relief. Baron Barthan presents well, but as you now know, he does many things in the dark. All for a specific purpose: to earn more money, improve the strength of his territory, and then accomplish merits to obtain the title of Viscount. This is also the goal of all nobles: move up to the next class. Although on the surface Baron status is already a status that 99% of people will aim for throughout their lives, this status is the lowest on the nobility ladder. Many have difficulty accepting this gap in reality, including Baron Barthan. It's also for this reason that many of them will use any means to achieve their goals. As he finished this sentence, Irit's face was calm. But Knight Jack and Knight Ron's faces were both sad and angry. Maxime observed all this calmly. So to get to the point, Baron Barthan will undoubtedly come and steal this mine from us, Irit finished.
But how could he?
Legally speaking, the mine belongs to you, asked Andrew suspiciously. Irit shook his head ironically. The law only serves to oppress civilians. Against the nobility, it's just a piece of paper. Andrew, Peter and Pietro were shocked by this reality. Rodrigo and Ernest seemed to know it already, judging by their unruffled expressions. Maxime naturally knew it too. It was part of the basics to know before going into eternity. On the bright side, he can only use brutal means to force us to concede the mine to him, said Irit, resuming his speech. All we have to do is wait until he starts attacking our villages and the mine. Baron Barthan is extremely likely to attack our villages which border this territory. Since if he takes the mine, he'll also take the territory that goes with it. According to our forecasts, 2 villages are in danger. They are the villages of Hunna and Plauta. I'll send 12 apprentice knights to protect Hunna and 3 apprentice knights to protect Plauta. Seeing where Irit's speech was going, Maxime asked him, "So I guess we'll have to protect Plauta?"
Irit nodded.
Indeed, Maxime, I'd like to entrust your mercenary group with the protection of Plauta. But Maxime still had a few questions. Why not send at least one of your 2 knights? If Baron Barthan sends a knight, my mercenary group could be eradicated and Plauta captured.
Irit shook his head.
In this kind of conflict, knights don't intervene easily otherwise. If just one of them dies, then barons like us will only have our eyes to cry over. The loss would be truly enormous. A knight is worth far more than a single iron mine. But the advantage being that in this kind of battle apprentice knights stuck at a certain stage can break through combat. So the important force in this kind of small skirmish is the apprentice knights followed by the elite soldiers. The ordinary soldiers are also important thanks to their numbers, but generally they're just cannon fodder. Maxime agreed with this. Indeed, he'd heard about it quickly while watching news reports. So, when do we have to leave? As soon as possible. Baron Barthan will undoubtedly send troops in less than a week. What if they don't attack for a long time? Asked Maxime. They'll certainly attack, replied Irit with a firm face. Okay, give me time to gather my mercenaries and we'll go to Plauta. Irit was glad it had all gone so smoothly. Ron, you'll protect the mine in case Baron Berthan goes mad and sends a knight, said Irit, addressing Ron.
All right.
That way, Ron can protect the mine directly but also come to your aid if things really get out of hand. Continued Irit, but this time addressing the saber-toothed tigers. Let's do it that way then, Maxime replied simply. The discussion continued, but this time in a more informal manner, with the mercenaries discussing anything and everything with the knights. The map was collected later, and various meals were served. This did indeed help to deepen relations. Maxime and his men didn't leave until late afternoon. As they crossed the sad garden again, Maxime heard a loud voice behind him. "Aren't you forgetting something, Max?" exclaimed Irit, shaking something in his hand. Baron Irit was a very sociable man, and called Maxime by his nickname very easily. It was just that he didn't get on with most of the nobles, and Baron Irit didn't like to pretend, so he appeared to be a loner to the other nobles. Maxime smiled, then returned to the top of the steps in front of the manor house. "Ron discussed this with you, didn't he? Here's your down payment of 200 gold coins." Maxime received the small but heavy linen package filled with gold coins. "Be careful and try not to croak easily. It would be a shame if the world didn't get to know your talent." "I'd be careful, Hubert," Maxime replied with a smile. Hubert was Baron Irit's first name. Maxime left as planned with his men. Watching Maxime leave, Hubert turned to Jack, who was still standing by his side. "Jack, you're watching Baron Kennepies from our northern villages, and you're putting the squeeze on him so he doesn't dare go too far." "That old man's too shy to take me on, aren't you worrying a bit too much?" replied Jack curiously.
I don't know.
"I prefer to be cautious, especially with so many people out to get me." The saber-toothed tigers returned to the inn where they had stayed the previous night, and rested there. Maxime didn't want his men to travel at night, believing it could be dangerous. Naturally, their presence was quickly made known, and all the inn's guests were quick to mention it. "They say upstairs are the famous mercenaries," whispered a merchant to a friend of his. "What's so special about these mercenaries? Most of them are simply cannon fodder for the nobles." The friend in question wore an air of disdain as he replied to the merchant. The trouble was, he spoke in a loud voice, attracting many hostile glances. This friend quickly noticed these stares and began to wonder where the problem lay in what he had said. "Are you sick of talking so loudly about mercenaries? If you want to get yourself killed, it'll be without me." The merchant looked particularly displeased but continued to whisper to his friend. "Right now these mercenaries are ultra popular in town, don't you know why?" The friend finally became curious.
Why?
The merchant smiled slightly and leaned toward his friend. "Because these mercenaries defeated 2 apprentice knights, including the young genius Henry." The man looked extremely astonished for a moment, but suddenly calmed down. A dozen seasoned mercenaries attacking young geniuses in a group, what have they got to be proud of? The merchant smiled with slight contempt at his friend's words.
A dozen mercenaries?
No, these apprentice knights were defeated in individual combat by these mercenaries. I think they were even younger than they were. The friend opened his eyes wide in surprise. "That's impossible. And it's not over yet." The merchant looked mischievous, watching his friend as he sipped his pint of mead. "Drop the info, it's okay." The merchant laughed lightly and decided to satisfy his friend's curiosity. Before the dumbfounded eyes of the crowd watching the excitement, Knight Jack appeared and decided to teach the young mercenaries a lesson for daring to resist the Baron's authority. But just then, a young man with blonde hair and blue eyes emerged from behind the mercenaries. It is said that this young man is the leader of the mercenaries and that he and his men were guests of the Baron. So after some unpleasant things appeared one after another in the evening, this young leader exploded in anger and sent Knight Jack flying. The man in front of the merchant spat what he was drinking on the table in surprise.
I beg your pardon?
A mercenary dared to hit a knight and on top of that sent him flying? The merchant laughed aloud.
Of course.
That's why these young mercenaries have such a good reputation in town right now.
The friend looked astonished.
At the same time, the gulf between the nobility and people like us is so huge. It's crazy that mercenaries from nowhere can take them on.
The merchant nodded.
That's for sure, but there's a second reason why we definitely shouldn't be talking badly about these mercenaries right now.
Really? Why?
The merchant remained silent for a moment, looking at his friend. All right, you've won, you greedy merchant. Spit out the truth now. The man in front of the merchant put 3 bronze coins on the table while swearing. Many people now wish to join this mercenary group, thinking they can change their future and climb the social class ladder in the future. They literally represent their hope to change their lives and gain wealth and fame. When the merchant declared this news, the man was also slightly tempted, but ended up shaking his head. How could it be so simple? We don't know the background of these young men, but to gain power you always have to pay the price. Maxime, who was upstairs, heard these words. With his physique, all his senses far exceeded those of ordinary people. Indeed, no power is easily granted. Here the price is to remain loyal to me forever and risk your life on the battlefield. I wonder how many of my mercenaries will still be alive, just by the end of the year. Maxime had been thinking about this for a while. So far none of his mercenaries had died, and all was well. But he knew that there was a very good chance that some of his men would die on the battlefield in the near future. Other people in the inn also discussed the saber-toothed tigers, but Maxime decided not to pay any more attention to them and simply fell asleep. The next day, Maxime and his men set off early to prepare for war as quickly as possible. Around lunchtime, they arrived at the bandits' former camp. Their arrival came as a pleasant surprise to the more than 50 mercenaries who had stayed behind, along with the women and children. Yes, despite his words, Maxime decided to shelter these women who had lost hope in life. He simply couldn't bear the thought of excluding them from the cave and leaving them to fend for themselves in the forest. Maxime mainly went to talk to Romuald about what had happened in the camp during his absence. Romuald told him that most of the women had regained some energy and were helping out with the camp's household chores. One in particular even chopped wood with the mercenaries, despite her extremely weak physique. She exuded a powerful resolve that made many mercenaries admire her. Some wanted to court her, but she firmly rejected any man who wished to approach her. But Laura developed a certain rapport with the woman, and they became friends.
Maxime was intrigued. What's her name? Ida, Romuald answered simply.
Maxime tried to remember the name, then continued talking with Romuald. Everyone here stayed another 3 days to prepare for their departure to Plauta. Counting Maxime's departure to Hydracamp, his return and now these 3 extra days, it had been 5 days since the former bandits had joined the saber-toothed tigers. During these 5 days, the new recruits were able to discover just how beneficial Maxime's talent was. Romuald assigned tasks to everyone, but left more free time for training to the mercenaries who had expressed their wish to join the battlefield. Although they didn't have time to reach the level of elite soldier, most were able to attain 1.3 physical points. This attracted the envious glances of the former bandits who had decided to become the saber-toothed tigers' logistics staff. They themselves had not progressed due to lack of free time. But no one changed their minds, believing that staying alive was the most important thing right now. Maxime respected these logistical personnel, because if he'd been in their shoes, he thought he'd have chosen security at first too, and then, once he'd become strong enough, he'd have asked to become a real mercenary. At dawn on the 6th day, when the first glimmers of sunlight pierced through the morning mist, the mercenaries stood ready, lined up and silent. Each wore his or her own equipment, giving the ensemble a motley look. The colors of their cloaks and capes ranged from dark brown to olive green, earthy tones that allowed them to blend into the countryside. Despite this diversity, a clear cohesion reigned in the group. The moment Maxime waved his hand, they set off, leaving the camp and heading into the forest, straight for the battle ahead. Women and children greeted them from afar, but without shouting. They didn't want to disturb the special atmosphere. Maxime did not ask his men to run. This time, his men didn't all have the strength of the first mercenaries, so he would tire most of them significantly if they had to run. Walking fast enough, Maxime had calculated that it would take around 8 hours to reach Plauta. It might take a little longer, since they were taking water and food with them, enough to last at least 3 days. They would see later if they could buy food and water from the villagers of Plauta. Time passed quickly and Maxime's little troop soon arrived at the village of Plauta. The village was disrupted by the sudden arrival of a large number of armed people. A small militia of around 100 people was quickly formed, blocking the path of the saber-toothed tigers. Seeing this crowd equipped with a few swords and pitchforks, Maxime laughed slightly but was at the same time impressed by their courage. "Stop here immediately, you're not welcome in our village." An old woman with a bent back came forward with the help of her wooden cane and shouted in the direction of Maxime and his men. Maxime stepped forward and explained the situation. "We come under the orders of Baron Irat to protect your village." But the old woman wasn't convinced. "Protect our village from what? Get out of here." Seeing the situation could take some time to resolve, Maxime chose to use the hard way to both gain time and establish his prestige. In this way, all things will become simpler in the future. Andrew, Rodrigo, Romuald, Ernest, Izo, Tenna, Piedro, James. The mercenaries whose names had been called came out of the mercenary group and went to Maxime's side. "Capture some of them, but definitely don't attack the grandmother."
Aye, sir."
The silhouettes of the mercenaries quickly charged into the militia and easily subdued some 15 villagers. The newly formed militia opened their eyes wide in fear of the mercenaries. A few of them still seemed courageous and wanted to help their comrades. "Don't come any closer or I'll crush this guy's throat." If you don't want to find your neighbor choked to death, I'd advise against moving forward. A missing arm or leg can happen very quickly. The mercenaries proliferated various threats, which intimidated the villagers. They no longer dared to advance. The old woman became calmer. We don't have the strength to resist, let the bandits have what they want. But before the villagers could obey, Maxime approached the old woman. We're not bandits, we're mercenaries here to protect the village for a while.
Protect us? Protect from what?
Even a rat wouldn't be interested in our village, we're so poor. Seeing that the villagers were unaware of the danger to which they were exposed, Maxime decided to tell them part of the truth. This would considerably increase their vigilance and thus their safety. Don't ask too many questions, but this village is very likely to be attacked in the next few days by a force that can be considered invincible to you.
Humph?
For a few thieves our militia is more than enough. And if these bandits include apprentice knights? When Maxime mentioned bandits, all the villagers panicked.
Village chief.
If that's true, we're all going to die, shouted a panic-stricken militiaman. The old woman frowned, doubting the words of the blonde-haired young man in front of her. But seeing the small army accompanying him, the old woman began to believe in Maxime. If you still don't believe me, there will be 3 apprentice knights from Hydra Camp arriving here soon. Hearing these last words from Maxime, the village head finally became convinced. So, you can enter the village. There's an inn which is intended for people who get lost in the surrounding area, or simply for people who are traveling. The old woman turned and started walking slowly to show where the inn was. The militia listened to their leader and let the mercenaries pass. Seeing the imposing aura of most of them, many militiamen swallowed their saliva. Even from the outside, everyone could tell that the difference between the mercenaries and the militia could be compared to the difference between a lion and a rabbit. The villagers, mostly women and children who had stayed at home, watched with curiosity as the armed men passed through their village. Seeing their village chief leading them, everyone was reassured and went back to their occupations. The old woman and the saber-toothed tigers soon arrived in front of the inn. Despite its rudimentary appearance and all wood construction, it still seemed warm and welcoming. Most of the time, the inn is completely empty like today, but it's quite small so you'll have to squeeze in. As long as we have a roof over our heads it's already very good, Maxime replied with a slight smile. The old woman observed the young man with blonde hair and blue eyes with a new look. Come on guys, put your stuff in the rooms and let's get something to eat. Everyone listened to Maxime's orders with a certain rigor. Everyone settled quietly into rooms designed for 2 people in groups of around 8 mercenaries. Your mercenaries are rather disciplined, commented the old woman. Maybe that's because they haven't had enough experience of death. The old woman laughed in a deep voice at Maxime's reply. But Maxime was serious about his answer, because it was the truth. Most of his men were stressed by the knowledge that they would be facing apprentice knights and elite soldiers. Even those who weren't particularly worried weren't in a good mood at the time. No one could know whether their lives would still be in their hands the next day. Despite your profession, I still hope for these young men's sake that they don't rub shoulders with death on a regular basis. Maxime didn't answer, instead asking something that concerned him. Will you be able to sell us some of your dried meat supplies, your vegetables, and tell us where to collect water?
Of course.
Maxime and the old woman began to talk about various aspects of mercenary life in the village. Despite her relatively advanced age, the old woman still had all her wits about her and spoke relatively well and quickly. However, she tired very quickly when it came to walking. So Maxime avoided putting too much strain on her and tried instead to communicate with the villagers.
3 days later.
Maxime had earned the villagers' gratitude not only by going out to talk to them every day, but also by going out himself to help the villagers with certain tasks requiring physical strength. Most of the mercenaries also had skills they had previously developed, and helped the villagers whenever they could with tasks requiring greater expertise. Everyone got used to living with mercenaries. It was also on this day, in the middle of the afternoon, that noise was heard outside the village. Maxime went to take a look, accompanied by about 30 of his men. The rest were scattered right and left in various tasks or training sessions. The old woman and most of the militia were also present. In front of them was a scene very similar to that of 3 days ago. Hello dear villager, I'm the apprentice knight at the stage of great success, Killian. By my side are Henry and Altia, 2 apprentice knights in the entry stage. We also have 10 elite soldiers and 80 ordinary soldiers accompanying us. Maxime watched from afar as this strong apprentice knight was fully equipped in iron armor and riding a strong sturdy horse. He had removed his helmet to show his sincerity. Killian was already a middle-aged man in his late 30s. His mature face could charm more than one woman, even among the nobility. Unfortunately, he had little hope of ever becoming a knight because his body lacked vital energy as he aged. Henry and Altia, who stood beside him, also rode trained horses and removed their helmets when they saw Killian do so. Henry was indeed the arrogant young apprentice knight Ernest had faced a few days earlier. His arrogance hadn't disappeared, but he still seemed full of self-confidence. Altia, on the other hand, was more reserved. Her flawless face and firm eyes, combined with her knight's apprentice outfit, made her look like a valkyrie. Many villagers and mercenaries could not help but admire her for a long time. She was known to be a genius on the same level as Henry, so she was likely to become a knight one day. Behind them were a number of horses tied to carriages, obviously loaded with provisions. All the soldiers appeared battle-hardened and highly disciplined. Their equipment was excellent, though far behind the quality worn by apprentice knights. Some of them carried a flag with a white background depicting a red buffalo, its horns looking particularly menacing. The old woman quickly observed these soldiers and had no doubt that they were Baron Irit soldiers. She'd already heard the news from Maxime, but she was particularly convinced by the fact that these soldiers looked far too professional to be bandits. "Welcome to our village of Plauta, apprentice knights and soldiers of the Lord." The old woman had once again stepped forward to welcome these new temporary residents.
Thank you. Can you let us in?
"My soldiers would like to rest and eat after walking for so long." Killian was clearly not tired, but it did seem that walking had tired many of the soldiers. "Of course you can go back. But for accommodation we had an inn, but it's currently occupied by saber-toothed tigers, and for food you'll have to prepare it yourself." The village chief's reply made Killian disgruntled. "Well, our mercenary friends will do us the pleasure of freeing the inn so that my soldiers can rest properly. Besides, we're Baron Irit soldiers and we've come to protect you. The least you could do would be to requisition a few villagers to serve our valiant fighters who will fight for you." Henry, standing behind Killian, was equally displeased, while Altia's expression remained unchanged. The old woman frowned, but was prepared to accept. This apprentice knight represented the authority of Baron Irit and therefore the nobility. A simple village chief like her had no power to refuse. However, just then Maxime emerged from the crowd and stood between Killian and the old woman.
I beg your pardon?
"You want to commandeer the inn and some of the citizens to serve you? Are the Baron's soldiers so useless that they can't fend for themselves? It's the law of the strongest. The weak submit to the strong, just as your mercenary group submitted to Baron Irit." As he said this, the apprentice knight Killian sounded very confident. "You know, I had started to build a dwelling for your soldiers with the help of my men, and I thought I'd let my men help you finish it. But now I've changed my mind." Killian remained contemplating Maxime from his horse, waiting for him to continue his sentence. "Let's have a duel. Whoever wins gets the inn, but also the absolute right to give orders to the loser on the battlefield." The apprentice knight laughed wildly. A mercenary wishes to challenge an apprentice knight to a duel? How embarrassing that a common insect suddenly thinks he's a match for a lion. But Maxime didn't change his expression. He was slowly getting used to the fact that his status was low in this world, and that to gain respect he had to impose himself via force every time. "Do you accept or not?" Killian remained silent for a moment, which was also when Henry recognized Maxime. The apprentice knights had long known that a group of mercenaries called the Saber-Toothed Tigers would help them protect the city. To them, they were just an ordinary mercenary group to be used as cannon fodder. However, when Henry looked closer, he recognized many familiar faces. However, it was already too late. "Of course, if I have to crush you to get you to accept our authority, there's no need to worry." Maxime nodded slightly and gave them a few pointers. "So, drop your things at the village's central square and then join my mercenaries south of the village. There's a large open space there that will allow us to fight without disturbing anyone or scaring the locals." Killian agreed and led his men not only to drop off their belongings but also to tie and feed the horses before returning to the forest. While they were on their way and the mercenaries waiting for them could be seen, Henry finally found the courage to warn Killian. "Captain, these mercenaries are not at all simple, especially their leader is of exceptional strength."
Exceptional?
"What kind of strength can reach an individual without a breathing method? That's ridiculous." Killian was particularly contemptuous, and he was even more so when he saw Maxime's back in the middle of the empty forest space, chatting with his mercenaries. Altia simply listened from the side without changing her expression. For her these things were not at all important and she simply wished to return as soon as possible to resume her training. Exceptional enough to send Knight Jack flying and wound him slightly.
What?
What did you just say?" At this point Killian was particularly panicked. And he became even more so when he saw Maxime turn around and look at him with a slight smile. He also realized at that precise moment that all the mercenaries surrounding Maxime were particularly confident and seemed to be expecting to watch a fine show. So he's the famous individual who dared to fend off Knight Jack and who also had men with the strength of an apprentice knight. Even Killian, who spent his time attending to various tasks assigned by the Baron in training, had heard of this recent rumor. But he hadn't listened to it without close attention. In this city, many legends and rumors circulated with ease, but the veracity of any of them could always be easily questioned. He didn't think this rumor turned out to be true. Altia, who was standing nearby and heard this, finally became curious and looked attentively at Maxime, who was standing less than 50 meters from her. Killian took a deep breath and reassured himself that even he could manage a surprise attack on a knight if given the chance. How could a common mercenary have the strength of a knight? It's impossible, of course, thought Killian as he arrived in front of Maxime. Killian was right. Maxime was far from having the strength of a knight at this stage. And to be honest with himself, Maxime didn't think he could easily defeat an apprentice knight at the grand success stage who had spent many years developing his sword skills and traversing various battlefields. But this battle had to be fought. Maxime beckoned to Killian as he drew his sword. "Are you ready?" Seeing Maxime draw his sword, Killian drew his too. The wind blew gently across the grassy plain. A few leaves from nearby trees fluttered in the air between the two combatants. The sky was an ominous gray, as if the world itself were holding its breath before the confrontation. In the center of this deserted field, two silhouettes faced each other. An apprentice knight in full iron armor holding his sword in both hands, and a sharp-eyed mercenary much more lightly equipped. Their drawn swords glinted in the dull light. The mercenary stood lightly, a simple-looking one-handed sword. He wore studded leather armor, reinforced with a few metal plates to protect his vital areas, but much lighter than that of his opponent. A mesh vest covered his shoulders and torso, leaving his movements fluid and swift. Maxime had found this equipment in the bandits' camp, and it wasn't just him, it had become the norm for early mercenaries. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, watched the knight's every move with cold concentration. All the mercenaries stood in about 20 meters behind Maxime, while the soldiers did the same behind Killian. Many of the villagers, including the old woman, stood further back, watching this rare event with a certain excitement. "I'll leave the first move to you." Hearing Maxime's words, Killian didn't hesitate and attacked directly. The silence broke as he charged, his sword coming down with a metallic hiss. The young mercenary deftly dodged, taking a quick step back, letting his opponent's blade strike the ground with force. The impact echoed across the field, raising a spray of earth. The mercenary took advantage of the opening and countered with a swift attack aimed at the apprentice knight's flanks. His blade met the steel of the armor with a thud, but without piercing the thick protection. "What strength!" murmured Killian with surprise and dread as he felt the pain in his body from the shock absorbed. Maxime was not only agile, the power that accompanied his sword was impressive. Whether mercenary or soldier, everyone began to stop looking at the duel as a game they thought they'd easily win. The apprentice knight pivoted, his heaviness offset by the brute strength he displayed with every blow. He raised his two-handed sword again and struck another powerful blow, seeking to crush his opponent by force. Maxime barely parried, but the shock made his arm tremble. He stepped back again, seeking to tire the knight and exploit the relative slowness of his armor. The duel became a balancing act between agility and power. The apprentice knight, though heavily equipped, had the experience of a noble fighter and was well trained. Every attack was precise, every move calculated. Maxime, who had not yet gained much combat experience, was defeated in this respect. Fortunately, his physique far surpassed Killian's, otherwise in a match of equal strength he might lose. After several exchanges, the mercenary's sword whistled through the air and struck the apprentice knight's arm with precision, just below the shoulder where the protection was thinner. Killian grunted in pain, but didn't waver. Sensing the tipping moment, the mercenary redoubled his speed, his blade searching for loopholes. But with every blow, the knight struck back with titanic force. In a fluid movement, the apprentice knight made a feint, suggesting he was about to bring down his sword, but deflected at the last moment to strike the mercenary on the flank. Maxime was unable to avoid the blow entirely. The blade bit into his reinforced leather, throwing him to the ground. Lying breathless for a moment, he sensed imminent danger and immediately rolled onto his side. The next second, Killian's coup de grace arrived, finally shattering the ground he'd just been on. Killian was panting now, his heavy, cumbersome armor beginning to weigh on him despite his impressive physique. In contrast, Maxime, though wounded, could still move easily. He circled the knight, striking and dodging, taking advantage of every opening with surgical precision. Then came the decisive moment. In a calculated dash, the mercenary ducked under the knight's broad attack and, with lightning speed, planted his blade directly into the apprentice knight's armor, level with the heart, before withdrawing it. The armor was easily pierced before the shocked eyes of Henry, Altia, and the soldiers. The mercenaries were much calmer. Killian stood still for a moment, as if surprised by the speed of the assault. The apprentice knight, sword still raised, staggered slightly before falling to his knees. Maxime, still holding his breath, stood a few steps away, bloody sword in hand, ready to parry any last gasp. But there was no more fighting. Killian laid his sword on the ground with a heavy thud, acknowledging his defeat in a final gesture of honor. Maxime, covered in dust, slowly nodded his head in respect. The fight was over, and everyone had played their part to the end. "Don't worry, you won't die." Killian looked up at the blonde-haired young man. He never thought he'd one day be defeated in a duel by a lowly mercenary. They had always despised them. He was firmly convinced that no matter how talented a person might be, it was impossible to compete with people who possessed the talent of a knight and practiced hard for decades. Yet on this day, he was defeated by a young man who had never practiced breathing methods and had relied solely on his talent and chaotic training methods. Of course, he couldn't have known that Maxime's strength depended not so much on his talent as on his financial wealth, but it was a unique talent in itself to be able to grow stronger this way. That was also the miracle of watches. On the surface, anyone could reach the top of their world with this unique talent. Of course, in reality, over 90% of watch owners will never achieve strength similar to or greater than that of knights. Had Maxime not possessed the Nox limit talent, he would simply have become a soldier for a nearby baron and saved up to smoothly progress through the class levels. This method, though stable, could take years before he had saved enough money to have the strength comparable to an apprentice knight. After that, it would take a decade to reach the strength of a knight without any special opportunities. And all that time had to be spent surviving various wars and skirmishes. Other avenues could be explored. For example, becoming a merchant and navigating between cities could be a way to earn money quickly, but the risks involved were far greater. So becoming strong wasn't really an easy thing, so awakened talent became extremely important and could more or less determine a person's upper limit and growth. Maxime had a complex look on his face as he watched this apprentice knight at the stage of great success. For him, being able to defeat him was the key to entering a great university. But above all, through his actions, he was beginning to challenge the authority of the nobles. To avoid any accidents, he had to start hiding part of his forces, just as he had begun to do by creating a base in the forest. But above all, he must avoid offending them as much as possible and instead make them his allies. "I was careful not to stick my sword too deep so it wouldn't reach your heart." Killian's eyes were grateful. "Thank you so much." Having such delicate control over his sword in a fight of such intensity, Killian couldn't help but begin to admire this young mercenary leader. His body was still tingling after coming so close to death. Henry watched the scene in total shock. Like Killian, he was firmly convinced that only the way of knights was supreme, and that those who relied solely on natural talent to grow stronger would eventually reach their limits. He couldn't be blamed for this since, to a certain extent, this was indeed the case. 99% of the people in the world of eternity possessed 1 or 2 star talents. 1-star talents had a limit of 1.5 points in physics and could, in their lifetime, hope to reach the level of an elite soldier after years of intense training. 2-star talents had a limit of 2 points in physics, and could hope to compete for some time with an apprentice knight at the entry stage, although they were almost certain to be defeated in the end. 3-star talents, on the other hand, were extremely rare, and could at most compete with an apprentice knight at the peak stage. But generally speaking, if a mercenary with a 3-star talent managed to reach the level of an apprentice at the peak stage, it was already an achievement. After all, to reach the limits of one's body required not only potential, but also a firm will to grow stronger. But to rival a knight was still impossible. Now, however, Henry had proof before his eyes that Maxime's successful attack on Chevalier Jack was not just luck. Maxime's strength and talent, which seemed appalling, were worthy of his respect. Not to mention that he had a group of mercenaries, several of whose members were already very powerful. Thinking of this, Henry suppressed his arrogance and looked more seriously at Andrew, Ernest, but also at other members of the group who seemed to him to be particularly strong. "Now I understand why the Baron only sent 3 apprentice knights to Plauta and 12 apprentice knights to Hainair. I've also heard that some mercenaries possess a talent for strengthening the people who follow them. Would that be the case with this guy? That might explain why there are so many strong men in a group of unknown mercenaries." As Henry's thoughts matured, Altia watched in amazement. She came from a farming family in a small village in Baron Irit. One day, the newly bred Ron Knight was given the task of going into the various villages of the territory and detecting whether there were any people with knightly talent. She was only 15 that day, and eligible to take the test. Her parents looked at her expectantly as she went to take the test, while she herself was very anxious. All her life, She'd heard about the exploits of knights and noblemen capable of defying physics and facing monsters with their bare hands. She idolized, respected and feared this kind of existence. So when Knight Ron detected this talent in her, she hoped to become such a person. She wanted to have the power to protect her family if anything ever happened. So of course she was extremely pleased when Knight Ron announced that she not only had a knightly talent, but that it was not far from average. She lived up to the expectations of Knights Jack and Ron, as well as Baron Iret, and trained for years before finally succeeding in becoming an apprentice knight. But now her whole psyche was in question. How could this man have become so powerful? He's not a knight, so normally it should be impossible to compete with Killian, let alone defeat him. I want to know how he got so strong. Thinking this, Altia was filled with conviction as he looked at Maxime. Maxime, however, didn't notice. Instead, he had other things on his mind. He looked at the crowd of soldiers who were now slightly worried about where they were going to sleep in the evening.
Soldier friends.
To be honest, this duel was totally derisory, but for as many of us as possible to come back alive from the battles ahead, I had no choice. The soldiers listened to Maxime without a sound, while the mercenaries wisely stood behind their leader. Our mercenary group represents 3/4 of the power in this village, and you represent the remaining quarter. Hearing this, the soldiers found it hard to believe Maxime. The fact that their captain, who was an apprentice knight at the stage of great success, had been defeated was already a shock to them. But this duel gave a great deal of credibility to Maxime's words, although a trace of doubt remained for the moment. So don't worry if you see many apprentice knights and elite soldiers on the battlefield. Our mercenary group has been paid to take them on, and we have the skills to repel them. The purpose of this speech was to set things straight, to establish Maximus' authority and the respect of his mercenaries, as well as to keep the morale of these soldiers up in case there really are a lot of enemies. As for accommodation, in any case, the inn was too small to house you all. So my men have already started living with villagers, and this method allows everyone to sleep much better instead of everyone being crowded together. In exchange, they help them with their daily chores, so I hope you can do the same. Obviously, this is only a temporary situation. My men have already started building a new inn to house us all. Maxime continued to talk lightly to the soldiers about certain things for the coming days. The mercenaries standing behind him watched in admiration. One had to admit that seeing a young man speak calmly and give orders to 100 soldiers who were all listening attentively and respectfully, showed excellent charisma. A few minutes later, Maxime finished speaking, not wanting to prolong things unnecessarily. Just then, Killian tried to stand up. Noticing this, Maxime held out his hand with a smile. Killian hesitated for a second, then firmly grasped the outstretched hand. Maxime then lifted him easily, and the two were very close. As they looked into each other's eyes and felt each other's closeness, they developed a good feeling for each other. They established a first bond of trust at that moment. Killian was still not cured, but his powerful physique helped him to recover quickly. Maxime is right, from now on everyone will listen to his orders. Anyone caught disobeying will get the same punishment as if they were disobeying their superior. Killian was a man of his word, and since he'd lost the bet, he was committed to respecting it. What's more, he lost nothing. Everything had been arranged so that as many people as possible could live comfortably in the village, while at the same time improving everyone's chances of survival on the battlefield. And so ended the first meeting between the mercenaries and the soldiers. The days passed quickly. By the 5th day after the arrival of the saber-toothed tigers, soldiers and mercenaries were already mixing well in the village. The villagers were also happy to have their burdens eased during this time. A scene involving a father, a mother, their 2 young children and also a mercenary and a soldier around the dining table was a common scene these days. It was pleasant for these villagers, whose lives were monotonous, to have new guests in their homes, each telling of their own experiences. The mercenaries often enjoyed recounting the stories they had heard or experienced with their leader. This brought animation, tension, sadness and laughter to the table. Of course, there were also a few conflicts, not least because some of the soldiers found it hard to accept the mercenaries' authority over them. But when Maxime arrived, these soldiers generally lost all their courage and the situation was easily resolved. When the situation became particularly complex, Killian intervened and applied military law. As the first troublemakers were punished, everyone became much wiser, and the atmosphere more convivial. The wooden inn that required everyone's efforts was finally built on the 8th day after the arrival of the saber-toothed tigers. Thanks to the new inn, not only the mercenaries who had stayed in the original inn, but also the mercenaries and soldiers who wanted more comfort and privacy found their happiness. On the 10th day after the arrival of the saber-toothed tigers, in the middle of the afternoon, soldiers and mercenaries talked to each other, worked with cheerful villagers, others trained. Andrew, Ernest, Laura and Organ were training as usual. They were the only 3-star talents in the mercenary group, so they knew how lucky they were, but also how much responsibility this talent entailed. Thanks to the Nox limit talent, which made their training 500% more effective, they improved very quickly. On the contrary, most of Maxime's first mercenaries had more or less reached the limits of their talent, so many of them spent more time improving their swordsmanship, often losing some of their initial conviction. Maxime also spent the day training his swordsmanship, since it was the only thing he could improve without spending gold coins. To this end, he spent time with Killian, who taught him many of the basics and key points of swordplay. His talent, Nox limit, enabled Maxime to grasp everything quickly, and his innate fighting skills made it easy for him to apply this advice in real combat. So in just a few days, Maxime gained 30 experience points in sword mastery, which finally enabled him to improve his sword mastery to level 3. Sword mastery level 3, 1/100. This was the level usually achieved by apprentice knights in the entry stage who had been training for years. For comparison, Killian's level 3 sword mastery was intermediate. This made Killian sigh because the world wasn't fair, but at the same time he reassured himself that he hadn't been defeated by just anyone. Remembering that 0 to 33 points was the beginner level, 34 to 66 the intermediate level, 67 to 90 the advanced level and 91 to 99 the expert level. Mastery of the sword at level 4 was generally accessible only to knights or apprentice knights at the peak who were extremely talented. Watching Maxime progress rapidly, and hearing regular compliments from Killian, Henry and Altia invested much more energy than usual in their training to become stronger. But the more they trained, the more desperate they became. Not only was Maxime progressing extremely rapidly, but they soon discovered that 4 mercenaries who were at their level had their strength taking off like a rocket. In comparison, they were as slow as turtles. Sometimes they wondered whether they really deserved the title of genius, or whether it was these mercenaries who were monsters. Fortunately, their spirits had not broken, for they had observed that there was indeed a mercenary of their level called Romwald who was stagnating, but also that many mercenaries at the level of elite soldier were stagnating. However, they had also seen that many of the mercenaries who had started out rather ordinary, had in the space of a few days come close to the level of elite soldiers. This shocked them both, and confirmed their hypothesis that Maxime would have a talent that would enable the mercenary to train extremely quickly. Simultaneously, a few ideas simmered in their minds as they noticed this, but they tried to suppress these thoughts. During the evening of the 11th day, Maxime and Laura found themselves discreetly in the woods. They'd been doing this for a few days already. They liked to talk about anything and everything at night, watching the sky or strolling around the nearby lakes. They didn't do anything special. But that evening, everything changed. Alert, alert, we're under attack. Alert, alert, new Psalms attacks. Unjun soldat esse precipita vers Maxime et Laura en Herlant. Les du hommes esse regardrant avant de esse precipiter vers le village. Ils la traversant rapidement, croisant de soldats et de mercenaires que venaient d'être prévenus. On sentait déjà l'odeur du sang à 1 kilomètre à la ronde, tandis que de Chris esse faisaient entendre au loin. Au loin, Killian esse battait férocement avec un puissant apprenti chevalier couvert de noir et masque, tenant du épées. Tout autre d'eux, la scène était macabre. Plusieurs coronets pouvaient être vus dans les environs. Il y avait de cadavres de soldats et de mercenaires. Les yeux encore ouverts et blancs, ils lèverent les yeux vers le ciel, comme pour dire, c'est donc là que ma vie est. Killian en était pas seul. Auteur de Louis Henry, Altia et de nombreux soldats et mercenaires esse bataillent férocement contre les hommes en noir. Andrew, Ernest, Organ et Romualdo en tout étaient bloqués par de adversaires puissants. Personne n'est domini le champ de bataille ici, c'était donc principalement une confrontation morale. Le premier groupe a n'est pas subir le poids de perte serait le groupe vaincu, c'était aussi simple que cela. De puissants mercenaires téléphones Chuizo, Peter, Terry et Tenna, que n'étaient pas aussi forts que les apprentices chevaliers mais étaient parmi les meilleurs soldats d'élite, étaient entourés de plusieurs hommes en noir. Plus tard, Killian patrouillait dans le village comme d'habitude. Le clair de lune éclairait faiblement la forêt que entourait le village. Il était accompagné de Romuald, d'une dizaine de soldats d'élite et de mercenaires et d'une vingtaine de simples soldats. Un autre patrouille était également en mouvement, de force similaire à la première. La nuit esse passe tranquillement comme d'habitude, et juste au moment où tout le monde commençait à baisser la garde et à discuter légèrement, Killian fit signe à tout le monde de s'arrêter. Malheureusement, Illinois était déjà trop tard, leur petite escouade était complètement encerclée. De nombreux soldats et mercenaires sont morts dans l'attaque surprise. Mais le soldat que porte le timbre, que surveille de signal d'alarme, était bien protégé et eu le temps de taper plusieurs fois pour sonner l'alarme. Grâce au son du timbre, la duxième patrouille menée par Andrew et accompagné de Henry a pu rapidement intervenir, mais la situation restait extrêmement défavorable. Ce n'est avec l'arrivée progressive de soldats et de mercenaires au repos que la situation s'est progressivement stabilisée. D'un coup d'œil, on pouvait voir qu'il y avait au moins une douzaine d'apprentices chevaliers, une cinquantaine de soldats d'élite et 200 soldats ordinaires parmi les individus qui avaient monté à l'embuscade. Sous l'effet d'une telle force, la petite escouade de patrouille fut pratiquement anéantie. Comme c'est honteux pour un apprenti chevalier de planifier de telles embuscades. Killian avait rapidement été regroupé par plusieurs apprentices chevaliers avant de essayer retrouver seul avec l'homme aux du épées. Il était déjà couvert de sang avec de multiples blessures sur tout le corps. Coadit que j'étais un apprenti chevalier. Arrête de faire semblant orac, nous savons depuis longtemps que tu allais attaquer nos villages. Orac était un apprenti chevalier bien connu du Baron Barton pour sa maîtrise exceptionnelle et unique de deux épées. He was at the same stage as Killian and of similar strength. Haha, good guess. It's a shame that even predicting our actions, you're all still going to die here. Orac removed his mask, revealing the ordinary face of a middle-aged man. Then Orac intensified his attack on Killian. Once I've killed you, the morale of your men will collapse rapidly and then it will be our victory. In saying this, Orac sounded confident and cheerful, but he himself sensed that tonight's action was not going well. I've never seen these men until now, yet these people should have a small reputation. Where did Baron Irat find them? Where do so many strong men come from? By chance he glanced at a red-haired young man who was surrounded by 3 apprentice knights at the entrance stage. Just then, he saw Andrew abandon defense altogether and swing his sword fiercely at an apprentice knight. An incredulous look on his face flew up, as if he still didn't realize what had just happened. Simultaneously, a sword was thrust deep into Andrew's abdomen. But before the masked knight apprentice could smile, he saw his opponent's eyes turn mockingly red. Are you trying to tickle me? Without changing his expression, Andrew shattered the apprentice knight's iron armor with a powerful swing of his sword. The latter looked down, and saw a sword planted deep in his heart. Is it even human to do that? He took one last look at the red-haired youth, fear filling his body for the last time in his life. Then Andrew withdrew his sword, and the apprentice knight's body fell heavily to the ground. You're the only one left. The last apprentice knight dressed in black tried to attack Andrew, but he couldn't find the courage. Orac then saw the whole scene unfold in just a few seconds. 2 apprentice knights died so easily. When the Baron finds out, I'm going to be heavily punished. As he thought this, his expression turned grim, and his desire to kill reached a new peak. He began to abandon defense and stepped up his attack to finish the battle as quickly as possible and avoid further losses. Not far away, the former bandit Iris who had dared to answer Maxime was fighting hard. He was part of the squad accompanying Killian and Romuald. All the previous days, he'd been filled with admiration at seeing so many strong, everyday people training hard. He followed suit and also trained ferociously, always pushing himself to the point of exhaustion. The results came quickly, and to his surprise, he achieved a strength similar to that of an elite soldier. He also enjoyed spending time with his old bandit friends, as well as his new comrades. But those beautiful days came to an end on that cold night. Hattel, Terran, Pedrick. Tears welled up in his eyes as he thought of the people with whom he'd once chatted, laughed and had fun, and who were now on the ground, either dying or already dead. But this was quickly covered by rage. Seeing numerous soldiers and mercenaries arriving as he went, he pushed his opponent back and shouted. Kill Baron Bothan's men. Avenge our fallen comrades. Several soldiers and mercenaries who had been in combat followed suit and shouted as well. Kill Baron Bothan's men. Avenge our fallen comrades. Kill Baron Bothan's men. Avenge our fallen comrades. Kill Baron Bothan's men. Avenge our fallen comrades. This had a negative impact on the morale of the men in black, who were beginning to worry about the opposition they were witnessing. The shouts were so loud that Maxime and Laura heard them. No good. We've got to hurry. Laura nodded solemnly and picked up the pace to the point of exhaustion. Every second that passed represented lives lost. Just then on the battlefield, Organ heard those loud cries. I never thought that at such a young age I'd be living and fighting alongside such brave men. He was fighting 2 apprentice knights, one in the entry stage and one in the small success stage. Before joining the saber-toothed tigers, Organ already had the strength of an apprentice knight in the entry stage, and after training for the last 10 days, he reached the level of an apprentice knight in the small success stage. Damn it, you little brats, you dare to attack a grandfather like me in a group. Do us a favor, and die here, Grandpa. It's not like you've got long to live anyway. The two apprentice knights had contemptuous expressions hidden behind their masks. But Organ wasn't angry. That's right, so today I'm going to protect my young comrades by taking you with me to the grave. Organ glanced quickly at Rodrigo, who was holding an axe, and who was entangled by an apprentice knight at the entrance stage. Va bien, murmured Organ with emotion-filled eyes. Then he went mad and rushed towards his two opponents. A man of such strength who no longer cared about his defense was far more threatening than an apprentice knight at the peak stage. So it wasn't long before the two men in black changed expression and began to defend themselves as best they could. Taking advantage of an opportunity when his comrade was attacked, the man at the stage of small success took the opportunity to cut Organ's left arm. The man smiled, pleased that the old man had finally been seriously wounded, with which he and his comrade should easily be able to finish him off. Afterwards, they could help their leader and then, like a domino effect, win the battle. With that, they'd win great military merit and then be heavily rewarded by the Baron. The two men were already excited just thinking about it. It's a pity that reality is often quite different from what one might imagine. Organ bore the pain like a superhuman being and immediately took advantage of the fact that his opponent had poured out his old strength and the new one hadn't yet been generated. No. Alexander, help me. The apprentice knight was horrified as he saw the sword coming towards him. Noticing the noise, Rodrigo glanced at Organ. He saw Organ rush towards his opponent and decapitate him. But he also saw that the apprentice knight at the entrance stage took the opportunity to plunge his sword into Organ's heart. No, no, no. Organ shit. Don't die here. Rodrigo had begun to develop a deep relationship with Organ since he'd met her, and they spent an enormous amount of time together. Rodrigo was even beginning to think of Organ as his paternal grandfather. He had finally begun to feel what it was like to have a loving family. Organ also liked Rodrigo a lot, and wondered if he'd built a family, what his life would have been like. But before Rodrigo's sad eyes, everything came to an end that evening. The apprentice knight withdrew his sword, and this time Organ couldn't bear it. He fell weakly to his knees, spitting blood into his throat. As if sensing something, he used the last of his strength and turned his head towards Rodrigo, less than 10 meters away. He smiled weakly for the last time. At that moment, the scene was frozen for a moment. The moonlight faintly illuminated Organ's smiling face. Then a sword fell swiftly on his neck, and his head flew off. The apprentice knight had just decapitated Organ. Nun. Rodrigo's distressed cry echoed across the battlefield. The cry was so loud that Maxime and Laura, who were still some distance from the battlefield, could hear it. A certain power began to emerge from Rodrigo's body at that moment. He couldn't guess where it came from, but instinctively he knew how to use it. His opponent was an apprentice knight at the entry stage. Indeed, although Rodrigo's physique was below 2 points, he had already proved by facing Organ that he could stand up to an apprentice knight. Rodrigo dived towards his opponent, wanting to settle the situation quickly and then avenge Organ. What an idiot. On other people it might work, but my sword is known to be the fastest under the stage of small success. His opponent was calm and full of confidence. He saw Rodrigo's heavy axe coming at him, dodged it easily and counterattacked. His sword arrived at the right side of Rodrigo's abdomen. With Rodrigo's current momentum, it was impossible for him to defend or dodge. His opponent smiled confidently. However, a hard sound resounded. A thick mass of earth had appeared where the sword was to land. What kind of magical power is this? The apprentice knight was shocked. He'd never seen anything like it in his life. Die. Before he could realize it, Rodrigo's axe was already back and sliced his body in two. The scene fell before the eyes of many black-clad assailants, mercenaries and soldiers alike. Now it's your turn. Rodrigo rushed towards Organ's murderer with a savage dash, like a bull charging towards its prey. The apprentice barely had time to counterattack, but just like the previous assailant, his sword was blocked by a mass of earth that appeared at the last moment and out of nowhere. Shit, that's cheating. Real cheating is putting two on an old person. Surprisingly, Rodrigo had heard the last murmurs of Organ's murderer and answered him while slicing his body in two. Blood splashed onto Rodrigo's face, but his expression didn't change at all. However, a wave of weakness passed through him. He felt he'd used up all the power that had appeared. But the fighting didn't stop, as all around him various soldiers and mercenaries continued their relentless battle. It wasn't long before a new assailant broke free and attacked Rodrigo. Fortunately, Rodrigo was able to quickly estimate the strength of his new adversary, and it was only at the level of the elite soldier. By this stage, of the dozen or so opposing apprentice knights initially detected, there were 13, and of the 13, only 8 remained. Andrew had killed 2 of them and was now facing the last one, but with great difficulty. His face was sweaty and his sword was shaking from the wound in his abdomen. Organ had killed 1 and was dead. Rodrigo managed to kill 2 with his elite soldier's physique. Ernest and Romuald were each entangled with 2 apprentice knights. Henry and Altia fought a complicated duel with 1 apprentice knight each. The last enemy apprentice knight was attacked by Terry, who was lean but had formidable reaction speed, and one of Baron Irit's elite soldiers, who possessed similar physical qualities. Between them, they managed to rival an apprentice knight. Time passed quickly, with everyone's wounds getting worse as mercenaries, soldiers and attackers continued to fall to the ground, never to rise again. Killian was becoming particularly weak in the face of Aurak's onslaught. He had already been wounded at the start by the sudden ambush, and as the fight went on, his wounds were getting worse. His sword seemed heavier and heavier, and his reactions slower and slower. If it hadn't been for his iron armor, he'd have been a cold corpse long ago. Noticing an opportunity, Aurak managed to fend off Killian's sword with his right hand, then continued his attack with his left. Killian noticed Aurak's victorious smile and panicked slightly, but there was nothing he could do to stop the sword.
Just then, a thud was heard.
Looking ahead, Aurak could see a beautiful young woman with black hair who had just blocked his sword. Aurak stepped back quickly. He had already lost much of his physical strength over time, so the arrival of a powerful person at this moment made him think about retreating. Simultaneously, cries were heard on the battlefield. He looked quickly in the direction of Andrew, Ernest, and the other powerful individuals previously blocking his men. He quickly noticed that the red-haired young man was lying on the ground, but his body was whole, unlike his opponent who had his head separated from his body. It wasn't just Andrew's opponent, 3 other of his men had fallen in a very short space of time, and now only he and 4 others remained among the apprentice knights. Terry's and the elite soldiers' opponents, Henry and Altia, now lay in their own blood. He could see a young man with blonde hair coming to the rescue of a blue-haired mercenary who was initially surrounded by 2 apprentice knights at the entry stage and a man at the small success stage. Surprisingly, these 2 young men easily repelled his soldiers, so much so that he estimated that in less than a minute, they would all be defeated.
Chief,
We're all going to die at this rate.
Chief, save us.
Chief, give the order to retreat. The 3 apprentice knights called out in distress. They themselves knew that the turn the battlefield was taking was very bad for them. The chief and the chefette have arrived. Great, let's hold the bastards back. Not one of them should leave here alive. Let's teach those bastards who killed our comrades a lesson.
Kill Baron Bothan's men. Avenge our dead comrades. Kill Baron Bothan's men. Avenge our fallen comrades. Kill Baron Bothan's men. Avenge our fallen comrades.
Various cries rang out from Maxime and Baron Irit's men. Aurak looked hatefully at Killian. You're lucky, you can still keep your head on your shoulders tonight. Everyone retreat. The men in black fled immediately after Aurak's order. You think you're in your own backyard and can come and go as you please? Everyone, don't let them escape. Maxime issued his orders with a furious face.
Yes, sir.
Since he'd arrived in this world, he'd never lost a single man. And that night, he lost more than a dozen of them in one fell swoop, including a mercenary with 3-star potential. When Maxime saw Organ's body, he was particularly furious. When he had improved his talent, Organ could have had the strength of a knight in the near future.
But now, the man was dead.
And it wasn't just him, Andrew was also badly wounded. Had he arrived later, the losses might have outweighed the gains of the mission. But now that he had arrived, these men in black could always dream if they wanted to escape. All the mercenaries and soldiers fiercely blocked the men's passage, even if it meant putting their lives in danger. If these people were allowed to leave, then they'd only come back stronger next time. Maxime positioned himself directly in the path of retreat of Ernest's 3 opponents. Several incoming mercenaries and soldiers stood not far from Maxime and the 3 apprentice knights. Everyone knew that the most important thing was to kill Baron Barthan's high-end power. The 3 apprentice knights began to panic. What's more, they didn't dare underestimate the young man in front of them after seeing so many young people with such monstrous power. Armed with his sword, Maxime charged bravely towards the 3 apprentice knights, then confronted his sword with that of one of his opponents. What power! The apprentice knight at the stage of small success seemed surprised. He had trained for years and years before reaching this level of strength and technique. But he had just been pushed aside by a young man who looked to be only around 18 years old.
Die.
The sword made a semicircle towards the apprentice knight's neck.
No.
But no matter how much he didn't want to see that sword come near him, it still continued in his direction. Then, finally, the sword moved away from him. Or rather, it was his head that moved away from the sword, while his body remained in the same place. The Baron had told us that this would be an extremely simple mission. How could our squad have encountered so much resistance in an ordinary village? Had he known, he'd never have proposed his participation in this mission. Looking back, he was full of enthusiasm, with a fierce desire to perform meritorious deeds to win the Baron's recognition and receive more resources. But that night his eyes were filled with regret. It was a pity there was no medicine for regret.
So weak.
Maxime had a physique exceeding 3 points counting bonuses, which represented a chasm compared to the mere apprentice knights in front of him who didn't exceed 2.5 points. What's more, his mastery of the sword had already reached a milestone with Killian's help, so the gap between the parties was enormous. By rough calculation, Maxime was at least 30 to 40% stronger than apprentice knights at the entry stage or at the stage of minor success. The two remaining apprentice knights immediately tried to escape, but at the cost of serious injuries, the mercenaries and soldiers who had positioned themselves managed to block them and even wound them. With their help, Maxime put an end to the lives of the remaining apprentice knights. Aurak watched his men die one after the other, a look of anger and sadness on his face. He also wanted to run, but every time he started to leave, Killian blocked his path. At the same time, Killian surrounded Aurak with Laura's help. Aurak's strength was similar to Killian's, so Laura's help was the last straw. Or rather, given her strength, it was another bucket of water added to the first. Aurak was completely submerged, her body full of wounds. You'll pay dearly for this. No one who dares offend the Baron ends well. Aurak was really furious at this point.
Who offended whom?
It's your Baron who should have thought twice before offending our chief. Laura already knew the ins and outs of the case from talking to the former mercenaries. Aurak kept his mouth shut at this point. He also knew his Baron's plans for this group of mercenaries. But who would have thought that this group would be so strong? At the same moment, Laura took advantage of a loophole in Aurak's guard and cut his neck. Aurak's head flew up, his eyes filled with incomprehension and anger. Soon, only the mercenaries and soldiers remained. The cold night wind rippled the tall grass, whistling softly between inert bodies and abandoned weapons. The ground was littered with corpses, a landscape of death frozen under the stars. Dented armor, broken swords and shattered shields lay on the ground, testifying to the fury of the battle that had raged hours earlier. Very few of the enemy had had the chance to flee. Those who had tried to escape had mostly been blocked or caught. From now on, the only thing that remained was victory, but there was nothing glorious about it. It was heavy, silent, almost oppressive. Maxime began to issue orders. Those who are slightly wounded, be sure to pierce all opposing bodies to make sure they're dead, then take back everything of value. The apprentice knights dressed in black all hid iron armor, make sure you take them back, they're precious. Those who still have energy, gather the bodies of our comrades at the forest clearing, in the same place where we had a duel with Killian. Romuald, full of wounds but still very much alive, approached Maxime. What do we do with the corpses of Baron Barthen's men? Romuald's eyes were complex as he said this. He knew most of these men, but the sword has neither wit nor wisdom. Let's leave them here. Answering this, Maxime's eyes were deep. Having ordered this, Maxime approached Andrew, who was still on the ground.
Still alive. No answer.
Maxime gave a little kick.
Who's that?
Leave me alone. A faint voice finally emerged. Maxime breathed a small sigh of relief. It's your boss, get off your ass if you're still alive.
Maxime? No, the floor's so comfortable.
And so warm, I wouldn't move. Idiot, you're bathing in your own blood, of course it's warmer on the ground.
I don't care.
Maxime laughed lightly, but he was still worried. Andrew had lost a lot of blood. Even though he had an extraordinary physique, it could be fatal. Somebody bring that idiot back. Several mercenaries came immediately and lifted Andrew. Andrew said nothing, seemed to have lost consciousness and was moved like a puppet by a few mercenaries, then taken back to town for treatment. Maxime then went to Organ's body. Rodrigo was on his knees beside him, tears falling to the floor from time to time. Maxime observed the scene for a moment, sensing the gravity of the moment, then gently knelt down beside his subordinate. His knees sank into the still warm earth, soaked with the blood of the dead. Apart from the blood that continued to flow, Organ simply looked like an old man smiling in his sleep. As if he'd found peace in this hell of iron and blood.
He's gone in peace, Maxime murmured.
He reached out a hand to the young mercenary's shoulder, feeling the tension and sadness in his tense body. Rodrigo clenched his fists, his dirty fingers digging into the damp earth. He had told me he intended to stay alive for a very long time yet. He wanted to see what it was like to have power.
He believed in you, Maxime.
Maxime didn't answer. Silence fell again, a moment of contemplation that even the night winds seemed to respect. All around them, mercenaries and victorious soldiers gathered their dead and dressed their wounds, but this corner of the field seemed strangely isolated from the rest.
We'll honor him, like all our fallen comrades tonight, Maxime said solemnly, rising to his feet. He deserves a farewell worthy of what he accomplished. But for now, we must move on.
He would have wanted that too.
Rodrigo nodded, still perturbed, but determined. Thank you, Chief.
Before leaving, he leaned over and closed the old man's eyelids, covering his face with a simple cloak. Then, with one last look, he straightened up, his heart heavy but his shoulders straight. Together they left that dark corner of the battlefield, leaving behind them the old man who now rested in peace, the smile still fixed on his lips as if he were finally living in a better place, far from the noise of battle and the fury of the world.